Chapter 263. The skinny old man looked like a dead tree, but this middle-aged fellow Taoist called him Taoist Kumu. The skinny old man on the other hand used a proper name, Tong Tianyun. Hearing Qin Shi's words, Taoist Kumu smiled. Fellow Taoist Shoujing is too modest. What's so shameful about that? People like us, who have been stuck in the core formation realm for hundreds of years without any progress and don't even have the chance to form our nascent souls, are so envious of you. Qin Shi smiled and said no more. He moved to the side and turned to look at Mo Tiange. Fellow Taoist, this is the junior martial sister I mentioned. Her Taoist name is Qingwei. Kumu and Tong Tianyun had long noticed Mo Tiange, but Qin Shi didn't say anything. They were also embarrassed to stare at a female cultivator, especially since she was wearing Shenqing School's Taoist robe like Qin Shi, so they were obviously from the same sect. Now that Qin Shi introduced her, they finally looked at Mo Tiange. Mo Tiange raised her hand and saluted them. Greetings, fellow Taoists. Kumu and Tong Tianyun saw that she was gentle and quiet, so they also stood up and saluted back. Right after they greeted each other, the bald fatty with a loud voice shouted, Qin Shoujing, this is your junior martial sister? I heard your master has an extraordinary disciple who formed her gold core before she was 100 years old. Is she the one? Qin Shi wasn't polite to this bald fatty. He said coldly, who else could it be? How could I have so many junior martial sisters? Before the bald fatty could answer, the woman Qin Shi called Madame Feng laughed first. Old Lei, I told you long ago that the person he agreed to go with him must be someone close to him, but you didn't believe me. What do you think? I guessed right, didn't I? Not only did he agree to go with us, but he also brought her in person. The bald fatty hugged his wine jar and said unhappily, Humph, you're good at calculating. He then raised his chin at Mo Tiange and said to Qin Shi, none of the five of us are mediocre. Why did you bring a little girl who just formed her gold core? Demonic Mountain is full of danger. What should we do if you implicate us? Qin Shi let out a humph, and cast a glance at Mo Tiange. He then turned towards the bald fatty and said somewhat arrogantly, you can also be considered not a mediocre person? If you're afraid of getting involved, I'll go with fellow Taoist Kumu and fellow Taoist Tong. Why do I need you? You. It was an obvious mockery. The fat on the bald fatty's face twitched, and he was about to fly into a rage. Qin Shi went on to say, although this junior martial sister of mine has just formed her gold core, she has a lot of treasures on her. Although her attacks are a bit inferior, self-defense isn't a problem. Besides, I'll take care of her safety. You don't have to worry about it. Even if they had some friendship with Qin Shoujing, these people were cultivators who had been in the cultivation world for hundreds of years. How could they allow a cultivator who had no ability to drag them down to travel with them? Now that they heard what he said, they all looked at Mo Tiange doubtfully. They believed that Qin Shoujing wouldn't lie, but how powerful could a cultivator who had just reached the core formation realm be? Under everyone's gazes, Mo Tiange showed a faint smile. Fellow Taoists, is there anyone who wants to compare notes with me? Kumu and Tong Tianyun didn't react to what she said. The bald fatty hugged his wine jar and was about to speak, but the woman beat him to it. The woman smiled before she spoke. She walked over and intimately held Mo Tiange's hand. Little sister. Before she could finish speaking and before her hand could touch Mo Tiange, Qin Shi flung his sleeve. A gust of wind blew, forcing her back several steps. After being beaten back by Qin Shi again and again today, the woman was also annoyed. She frowned and put her hands on her hips, looking like a shrew in the marketplace. She didn't have any of her previous flirtatious attitude. Qin Shoujing, you're so unreasonable. I won't eat your junior martial sister. What do you mean by acting like this? Qin Shi's expression didn't change. He looked at her hand and said, if you talked to her nicely, I wouldn't have stopped you, but why did you smear poison on your hand? The woman didn't feel embarrassed even though she was exposed. Instead, she showed a bright smile. It was your junior martial sister who said she wanted to compare notes with me. I just wanted to test whether she was vigilant or not. Is that still not okay? You blocked it for her. What do you think about that? Qin Shi said calmly, even if you used poison on her, it'd be useless. You might as well save your strength. The woman was confused. What do you mean? Her physique is special. Her meridians and dantian are different from those of ordinary people. Your tricks are useless against her. Qin Shi looked at Mo Tiange and said, junior martial sister Qingwei, this is poisonous Lady Du Fengjin. You can just call her Madame Feng. As for this one, his name is Lei Dongqing. Poisonous Lady Du Fengjin? Mo Tiange's heart skipped a beat. She had heard a little about Poisonous Lady. She was an individual cultivator with extremely ruthless methods. Although the cultivation technique she practiced was righteous path, her methods were a bit evil. People who liked her called her Madame Feng, while people who didn't like her called her Poisonous Lady. She really didn't expect this senior martial brother Shoujing to be involved with such a person. However, what she said wasn't false. A cultivator's body had an extremely strong resistance to poison. If a cultivator wanted to be poisoned, they had to start from her meridians and dantian. Mo Chinga wasn't afraid of this. After going through the 5 spirits cultivation method, her meridians and dantian were extremely tough and hard to be injured. It was difficult for so-called poison to have any effect on her. Mo Chinga raised her hand. So it's Madame Feng and fellow Taoist Lei. Nice to meet you. She obviously didn't show the same courtesy to these two people as she did to Kumu and Tong Tianyun. Since these two people weren't polite enough to her, she also returned the courtesy. At that moment, Tong Tianyun, who had been watching them with a smile on his face, stood up. The old man glanced at Madame Feng and Lei Dongqing, then said to Mo Chinga with a smile, "When fellow Taoist Qingwei came in just now, I sensed that fellow Taoist divine sense seemed to surpass cultivators in the same realm as you. How about letting me and fellow Taoist Qingwei have a fight of divine sense?" Fellow Taoist Tong. Both Madame Feng and Lei Dongqing were stunned for a moment before they blurted out. The so-called fight of divine sense could only be used by cultivators whose divine sense had reached a certain level. Generally speaking, only those who had formed their gold core could have such a level of divine sense. A sufficiently strong divine sense could simulate a cultivator's magic, and the simulated magic was directly related to the strength of the cultivator's fighting ability. Therefore, if cultivators didn't want to directly fight each other with their weapons, they could use their divine senses to simulate a fight of magical powers. This way they could also compare who was stronger and who was weaker. However, this kind of fight of magical powers could also cause damage to one's divine sense, especially to those with weak divine senses. Mo Chinga saw that they seemed very surprised, so she guessed that this Tong Tianyun's divine sense might be very powerful. She then raised her head to look at Qin Shi, only to see him secretly nodding, so she said with a smile, "Fellow Taoist Tong, I've just formed my gold core, so I hope you won't go overboard." Taoist Kumu clapped his hands and said with a smile, "Although fellow Taoist Qingwei is young, you're very courageous. You're worthy of being Lord Taoist Jinghe's disciple. That being the case, how about this old Taoist be the mediator?" Qin Shi said, "Fellow Taoist Kumu's words are very good." Tong Tianyun also said, "It's naturally good to have fellow Taoist Kumu as the referee." A so-called fight of divine sense didn't require a large space. Even a small room like this one was fine. However, this was a restaurant after all. Not only were there many mortals, but even the cultivators here were mainly low-level cultivators. It wasn't easy to see core formation cultivators here. Most of the core formation cultivators in Quanzhong City were probably in this room. Mo Chinga originally thought they would change places, but unexpectedly, Taoist Kumu took out an upside-down glazed wine cup. His eyes were half closed as he mumbled something. After a while he shouted, "Go!" The wine cup suddenly shone brightly and enlarged, covering half of the room inside. Mo Chinga looked up. Glazed was transparent, so the 5 of them could clearly see the outside from inside the wine cup. Taoist Kumu said with a smile, "Fellow Taoist Kumu, please, but you must be careful. Although my heaven-shrouding cup is a magic weapon, it can't withstand a full blow from the 2 of you." Tong Tianyun smiled while stroking his beard. "Fellow Taoist Kumu, you're too modest. 80 years ago, if it weren't for your heaven-shrouding cup, we might have died on Demonic Mountain." Mo Chinga's heart skipped a beat. Did they also go to Demonic Mountain 80 years ago? Before she could say anything, Tong Tianyun already said, "Fellow Taoist Qingwei, let's get started, shall we?" Mo Chinga had to put aside the matter just now and nodded. "All right, fellow Taoist Tong, please." The 2 of them stood in the middle, facing each other, and the other 4 people made way for them. Tong Tianyun and Mo Chinga closed their eyes at the same time and circulated their aura to adjust their breaths. As time passed, a gust of wind slowly flowed between them, rolling up their clothes and hair. Then this gust of wind became stronger and stronger, gradually enveloping the 2 of them until they couldn't see their figures clearly. Upon seeing this scene, Lei Dongqing uttered an "ha," and said with a bit of astonishment, "Qin Shoujing, your junior martial sister has just formed her gold core, but her divine sense can already transform into wind?" Transforming divine sense into wind looked simple, but in fact it wasn't easy. Wind could only be generated when one's divine sense operated quickly. Who knew how many times their divine senses had exchanged blows for this scene in front of them to have such an effect? Qin, she said faintly, I've already told you. Although she's just formed her gold core, protecting herself won't be a problem. Although he hadn't seen her all these years, his master had already told him about her matters. At first glance, he knew the magic weapons in her hands weren't ordinary items. Moreover, the soul-refining art was originally given to senior martial brother Xianyin by his master, so he naturally had confidence in her. The wind in the field became stronger and stronger, causing everyone's sleeves to flutter in the wind. Not only Mo Chenga and Tong Tianyun, but even the onlookers' expressions gradually turned solemn. Bang! All of a sudden, a loud sound came from the heaven-covering cup. The people trapped inside the cup felt as if the wind was being cut by a knife. Each of them operated their spiritual aura shields to resist this strong wind. Although each of them had their own unique skills, these two people were fighting with their divine senses, so they absolutely couldn't be disturbed, so they could only use their spiritual aura shields to resist. After the first sound, the heaven-covering cup continued to make loud noises one after another, each more violent than the last. Kumu frowned. He looked very surprised as he stared in Mo Chenga's direction. Since his heaven-covering cup made such loud noises, their fight of divine senses was obviously quite fierce. He knew how powerful Tong Tianyun's divine sense was. This little girl had just formed her gold core and didn't look very strong, but she actually had such a strong divine sense? All of a sudden, the inner wall of the heaven-covering cup exploded like firecrackers. The gale around them suddenly stopped, and the two of them finally showed themselves. When he looked up, he saw that Mo Chenga looked like she was in pain. Her eyes hadn't opened yet, but blood was flowing from the corner of her mouth. Chenga? Qin, she frowned. He quickly stepped forward, pulled her hand and pressed her meridians. After a while, he heaved a sigh of relief and let go. On the opposite side, Tong Tianyun's expression also didn't look too good. He slowly opened his eyes and stared deeply at Mo Chenga. After a while, Mo Chenga finally caught her breath. She wiped the blood from the corner of her mouth, then cupped her hands towards Tong Tianyun with a smile. I admit defeat. Tong Tianyun shook his head. Fellow Daoist Qingwei, you don't need to be so modest. I've been stuck in the middle stage of the core formation realm for 300 years. Although I've never been able to make a realm breakthrough, there are very few cultivators in the same realm who can be my match. Fellow Daoist, you've just formed your gold core, but your divine sense is already this powerful. It's already very rare. This fight was naturally won by Tong Tianyun, but Mo Chenga's loss wasn't too ugly. Daoist Kumu's gaze shifted between the two of them. He then said with a smile, Fellow Daoist Qingwei, this fight isn't about winning. Since fellow Daoist Tong said so, it means fellow Daoist has enough ability to travel with us. That being the case, the agreement between fellow Daoist Shoujing is valid. From now on, fellow Daoist is our companion. Chapter 264. Having obtained Daoist Kumu's approval, Mo Chenga smiled and cupped her hands. Thank you very much. She knew clearly that Daoist Kumu and Tong Tianyun might be doing this for Qin Shi's sake. However, she also had confidence in herself. Even if she couldn't help them, she wouldn't drag them down. Moreover, who could compare to her in terms of escape strategy? Even the noisy Lei Dongqing and Madame Feng were speechless after this competition. Seeing Daoist Kumu put away the heaven-covering cup and start talking again, the two of them said their goodbyes and left, looking very bored. Tong Tianyun looked at the two of them, then turned around and said to Mo Chenga with a smile, Fellow Daoist Qingwei, please don't mind them. They've always been like this. Mo Chenga smiled back, but before she could say anything, Qin Shi already said, Fellow Daoist Kumu, fellow Daoist Tong, my junior martial sister and I came from afar and haven't settled down yet, so we should take our leave first. Since he said so, the two of them couldn't stay any longer, so they made an inviting gesture and saw them off. Mo Chenga followed Qin Shi. As soon as he went down the restaurant, someone immediately came to greet them and took them to a secluded courtyard. Qin Shi entered the courtyard, casually laid a defensive formation and took the lead into the small hall. This courtyard was very elegant. It was spring now, so there were many peach trees planted in the courtyard. The trees were full of peach blossoms, and the fragrance of peach blossoms assailed their nostrils. Inside the small hall, there were exquisite wooden tables, chairs and stools. Peach blossoms were in full bloom in a blue enamel vase, making the place even more elegant. All the objects were placed in the most suitable places. They were clean and spotless, and even the tea was warm. Mo Chenga looked around and saw that Qin Shi had casually chosen a seat and sat down. He poured 2 cups of tea and held one for himself. She hesitated for a moment, then sat down on the other side and slowly picked up the other cup. Steam rose up and blurred their vision. Neither of them said anything. After a while, Mo Tiange heard his voice. Daoist Kumu and Tong Tianyun are both individual cultivators in Kuanzhong City. Although they don't belong to any cultivation group, their skills are extraordinary. They each have their own secret techniques, and they're the best among core formation cultivators in the whole of Kunwu. Mo Tiange paused for a moment before answering softly. Qin, she continued on, as for Lei Dongqing and Madame Feng, you mustn't underestimate them. Lei Dongqing is actually a cultivator from Tiandao sect, but because he offended someone in the sect, he was sent to a remote place. Although his cultivation level is only in the middle stage of the core formation realm, his divine power is extraordinary. As for Madame Feng, her tricks are very strange and it's very difficult for ordinary people to guard against her. She doesn't like you now, so you must be very careful when you face her alone. After a moment of silence, Mo Tiange asked, why doesn't she like me? Qin, she raised the corners of his lips, revealing a faint smile. Don't be fooled by Madame Feng's flirtatious ways. In fact, she's the most arrogant one. She usually looks down on female cultivators who don't make progress, especially female cultivators from big cultivation groups. Their cultivation conditions are obviously excellent, but very few of them make progress. Now that she has seen you for the first time, she only knows your identity, so naturally she doesn't like you. Upon seeing the smile on his face, Mo Tiange blurted out, Senior Marshal Brother, do you like people like Madame Feng? As soon as she asked, she realized she went a bit too far, so she immediately said, I was being rude. Senior Marshal Brother, please don't blame me. Qin, she was stunned for a moment before he said, I usually don't like women, especially those female cultivators who obviously have good aptitudes but only know how to fight for a man's favor. They're really wasteful. Although Madame Feng's temperament isn't compatible with mine, I like her on this point, so I'm also willing to be friends with her. I see, Mo Tiange murmured. She then changed the topic and asked, Senior Marshal Brother Shoujing, fellow Daoist Tong said more than 80 years ago, if it weren't for Daoist Kumu's sky-covering cup, all of you would have died on Demonic Mountain. What's going on? This. Qin, she muttered to himself for a moment, then said, I won't hide it from you. I met those people when I went out on a trip after I formed my gold core. Later we agreed to go to Demonic Mountain, and it was on this trip that I met your father. Mo Tiange suddenly looked up and stared at him. Under her gaze, Qin, she slowly said, in the beginning there were quite a lot of people who went with us. Later many people died unexpectedly and only 7 or 8 people were left. Later your father and I were separated from them. They retreated in time, so we managed to keep our lives. However, your father and I were trapped inside and couldn't escape. This was the first time Mo Tiange heard the person in question mention her father. Her gaze flickered and she slowly asked, Senior Marshal Brother Shoujing, my father? How did he die? Qin, she turned his face away. It was a bit difficult for him to meet her gaze, so he tried his best to suppress his tone. Your father and I were trapped on Demonic Mountain for nearly 10 years. We encountered countless dangers and we were also injured. Later, your father was heavily injured and couldn't drag on any longer, while I was stuck in my cultivation realm and couldn't escape. In the end, your father really couldn't drag on any longer, so he said he would do his best to help me escape. If I really escaped with my life, I would promise him a few things. He originally didn't care too much about this part of the past. Demonic Mountain wasn't the only danger he'd experienced in his life, but now, it had a different meaning to him. If he hadn't met Yi Hai on Demonic Mountain back then, if he hadn't been trapped together with Yi Hai, if he hadn't promised Yi Hai's requests, they probably wouldn't have been involved in this life. After hesitating for a moment, he finally said, Tiange, about your father's matter, I did it for myself, or? Mo Tiange's gaze flickered, but she soon shook her head. Senior Marshal Brother, you don't have to do this. Even without you, my father would have been trapped on Demonic Mountain in the end. Besides, you also promised him a lot of things, so we're even. Qin, she was silent. At first he didn't think what he did was wrong. Based on the personality of cultivators, it wouldn't be a big crime for him to forcibly seize Yi Hai's cultivation when Yi Hai was heavily injured. However, he wasn't the kind of person who didn't care about his state of mind, so he made a fair deal with Yi Hai. That way he would have a clear conscience and could also save himself from inner demons. However, this matter was related to her past, so he couldn't help but feel a trace of guilt. The two of them sat for a while. Qin, she couldn't stand the silence anymore, so he took the initiative to speak. I remember the place where your father died very clearly. At that time I didn't bring his remains out, so I don't know if they're still intact after so many years. Let's go to Demonic Mountain and take a look there. Mo Chinga forced a smile but didn't answer. She shouldn't care so much about the remains. Just like back then when she couldn't find Tianxiao's ashes, she told her this. Cultivators shouldn't be bound by external things. People were already dead and burial was only to comfort the living, so she should follow her heart. However, her father's death had been a knot in her heart for so many years. She still hoped to finish what she started and bring her father's remains back to be buried with her mother. Seeing that she still didn't speak, she pondered for a while then said, aside from the four of them, there's another cultivator from Gujian sect who hasn't arrived yet. When that person also arrives we can set off. Mo Chenga answered softly. In any case he had his own ideas about these things so she couldn't interfere. The two of them really had nothing to say so they sat for a while. Then Mo Chenga asked, Senior Marshal Brother Shoujing, how long are we going to stay here? Probably in 3 to 5 days. Gujian sect isn't far from here. That person already sent a message so they should set off in 1 or 2 days. In the end, she couldn't stand the silence anymore. He wanted to take the initiative to speak, but Mo Chenga stood up first. Senior Marshal Brother, I'm going to adjust my breath for a while. Where will I stay? Shi's eyes flashed with disappointment. He pointed to the side and said, you can pick any room you want. It doesn't matter. All right. Mo Chenga didn't say anything else and left without saying anything else. She sat alone for a while. Looking at the 2 cups of tea on the table, he suddenly did a very ridiculous thing. He reached out to take the teacup she didn't drink from, drank it up and put the cup in his pocket. After Lei Dongqing, Madame Feng, Qin Shi and Mo Chenga left, Daoist Kumu and Tong Tianyun sat in the side room for a while without saying anything. Daoist Kumu raised his hand, and a soundproof barrier appeared around the two of them. Fellow Daoist Tong, what do you think? Tong Tianyun pondered for a while then picked up a black chess piece and put it on the empty chessboard. We'll have to wait and see. Daoist Kumu stroked his beard and smiled. Fellow Daoist Tong, it seems you have a very high opinion of this Master Daoist Qingwei. A smile appeared on Tong Tianyun's dry, almost fleshless face. It's not easy for a cultivator who's just formed her gold core to be able to do this. She's worthy of being an outstanding disciple of a famous cultivation group. Daoist Kumu nodded. I couldn't sense the fight between the two of you. This shows that this Master Daoist Qingwei's divine sense is also extraordinary. An early-stage core formation cultivator's realm might still be stable, but she's actually able to do this. It's really not easy. At this point, the meaning of his words changed. But isn't this too hasty? Whether it's Lei Dongqing, Madame Feng or fellow Daoist Jing, they're all famous core formation cultivators in Kunwu. Even if Qin Shoujing's cultivation level surpasses all of ours, leading a newbie who's just formed her gold core seems a bit. Brother Kumu, why are you worried? Tong Tianyun grinned. His face was dry and small so when he smiled he looked really scary. Why don't you think about it this way? It's said that this Master Daoist Qingwei's aptitude is extremely high, far surpassing her peers. She formed her gold core at such a young age and is known as Xianqing School's most talented genius cultivator. This kind of person has a boundless future, so why are they willing to let her go to Demonic Mountain and take risks? Among us, you and I don't have much time left in our lifespans, and we're individual cultivators, so we have no choice but to risk our lives. Madame Feng, Lei Dongqing and fellow Daoist Jing all have their own difficulties. Even Qin Shoujing, although he's still young and his cultivation level is also the highest, he's failed to form his nascent soul 3 times. Everyone has their own reasons so they have no choice but to take risks. What about fellow Daoist Qingwei? Let's not talk about her own reasons, but why does Xianqing School want to let her go? Maybe they believe Qin Shoujing can protect her, but if she's really an idiot she's not worthy of Qin Shoujing's protection, right? That's true. Daoist Kumu picked up the white chess piece and put it opposite the black one. However, with this kind of divine sense, this fellow Daoist Qingwei definitely isn't an idiot. I just don't know whether she's worthy of being called a genius or not. Chapter 265. Mo Chenga stayed in Quanzhong City for several days. In addition to adjusting her breath and cultivating in this small courtyard, she occasionally went out for a walk. Although Quanzhong City couldn't be compared to a big city in the secular world, it was the #1 trading city in Kunwu. It would be a waste not to walk around here. Although it was difficult for cultivators above the core formation realm to find treasures they liked in this kind of ordinary market square, a trading city was a trading city after all. Kuanzhong City was known in Kunwo for having everything you could think of but nothing you couldn't buy. It had its own uniqueness. Before leaving, Mo Chinga took some of the materials the school collected for her to refine the heaven and earth fan with her. Now that she thought about it carefully, she realized there wasn't much difference. Those miscellaneous materials were all collected. The only things she lacked were the 1,000-year-old chalcedony and the Chiyun stone. Chiyun stone was indeed rare. Not many people even knew about it. Although many people knew about the 1,000-year-old chalcedony, it rarely appeared in the world. Even if it did, it would be quickly bought. Mo Chinga had lived in Kuanzhong City before, so she knew there were trade fairs for high-level cultivators in this city, so she sent a summoning talisman to Qin Shi and mentioned it. Qin Shi quickly replied to her, saying he knew and would take her there. Mo Chinga was dazed for a while after receiving this reply. The reason why she asked Qin Shi was because he said Taoist Kumu and Tong Tianyun were individual cultivators in Kuanzhong City. With their cultivation levels, they must be among the city's municipal officials, so they naturally knew about these trade fairs. She didn't expect Qin Shi would take her there himself, but she couldn't refuse. After thinking about it, it wasn't a big deal. Trade fairs were like this. What did it matter if other people were there or not? Sure enough, Qin Shi sent her a message that night. Mo Chinga packed her things, opened the door and saw him standing outside. Senior Marshal Brother Shoujing. Qin Shi nodded. Without beating around the bush, he said directly, "Let's go. If you want to go to the trade fair, there'll be one soon." Judging from his attitude, he seemed to be very familiar with this Kuanzhong City. Mo Chinga silently followed behind him. She didn't use her flying technique and just walked around the city in twists and turns. It was the middle of the night. The bustling Kuanzhong City during the day was quiet. Only a few cultivators were hurrying on their way, and mortals were nowhere to be seen. Most of these cultivators had high cultivation levels and had the same goal. Mo Chinga watched as these cultivators all walked towards the tallest Kuanzhong pagoda in the city. Qin Shi led her in the same direction. Unexpectedly, after walking for a while, he pulled her hand and whispered, "This way." His fingers were slightly cold, carrying the special coldness of a cultivator. They parted as soon as they touched. The two of them entered the back door of a nearby shop. This back door had other mysteries. As soon as they pushed the door open and entered, a low-level cultivator said in a low voice, "Welcome, senior." It was a woman's voice and it was very sweet. No matter where it was, there was no lack of female cultivators as a means of receiving guests. Mo Chinga sighed inwardly but didn't say anything. She just followed Qin Shi. There was a female cultivator leading the way in front of them. They entered the courtyard and then entered a tunnel. Soon, the view in front of them suddenly became clear. "Seniors, please do as you please. If there's anything you need, please call us." The aura-refining female cultivator respectfully bowed, then retreated into the darkness. Mo Chinga looked around. The layout of this small hall was simple and there were a lot of chairs placed around it. Several cultivators were resting and waiting. Among these people, the lowest cultivation level was in the middle stage of the foundation building realm. Aside from them, there were also two core formation cultivators. Qin Shi gestured, and the two of them found a corner to sit down. He then raised his hands, laying a soundproof barrier. He said to her, "This is a trade fair for the highest level people in Kuanzhong City. Even Kuanzhong City's administrators will participate." Mo Chinga was a bit surprised. "They also need to participate in the trade fair?" Qin Shi smiled and said, "Kuanzhong City doesn't have a city lord. There are only several highly respected individual cultivators who form an individual cultivator alliance to manage the trade fair. Even so, they don't have any special privileges when it comes to trading. They just have more sources of information, so it's easier for them to find what they need." This management method is indeed special, Mo Chinga thought inwardly. Qin Shi continued to say, "The Individual Cultivator Alliance in Kuanzhong City has a total of 7 core formation cultivators, and one of them will preside over this trade fair. In this trade fair, they'll allow 1 or 2 of Kuanzhong City's best shops to auction off their best treasures. After that, cultivators can trade among themselves as long as they pay a small fee. This trade fair is also famous in Kunwo. Cultivators below the core formation realm can only participate if they have some background. Core formation cultivators often come because of its reputation." Mo Chinga was stunned. There are actually so many core formation cultivators in Kuanzhong City? If they could trade among themselves, there should be at least 10 of them, right? Qin Shi shook his head. "These cultivators came here specifically to trade. They won't stay. How can core formation cultivators be so easy to meet?" Usually there are only about 10 of them in Kuanzhong City, and most of them are members of individual cultivator alliances. Otherwise, how could they manage Kuanzhong City? If there were that many core formation cultivators, this individual cultivator alliance probably wouldn't be able to suppress them. The two of them sat for a while before Qin Shi asked, "Junior Marshal Sister Qingwei, what do you want to buy? Don't tell me you can't buy it from the steward's hall?" Mo Chenga couldn't quite get used to the way he kept calling her. After a while she finally answered, "It's materials to refine a natal magic weapon. The steward's hall has collected most of the materials, but it's still lacking two rare items." "What are they?" "1,000-year-old chalcedony and Qiyun stone." Qin Shi frowned and said, 1,000-year-old chalcedony can be seen occasionally, but it has a wide range of uses. It can be used to concoct medicinal pills and refine tools, so it's usually bought at a high price as soon as it appears. You need a bit of luck to get it. As for this Qiyun stone, I remember seeing it in a small place about 100 years ago. Unfortunately, I didn't know what it was at that time and didn't buy it. So many years have passed and I don't know whose hands it is now. Mo Chenga was delighted. "Senior Marshal Brother Shoujing, do you know what Qiyun stone looks like?" Qin Shi nodded. "But that was 100 years ago. If you want me to find it, I won't be able to do anything." "That won't be necessary." Mo Chenga smiled and said, "Few people know about this Qiyun stone. I asked my master, but even he only heard of it and never saw it. He also doesn't know what it looks like, so he can't find it." Seeing her smiling face, Qin Shi was stunned and didn't answer for a long time. Mo Chenga thought he was unwilling, so she slowly stopped smiling. "If it's not convenient for Senior Marshal Brother, forget it." "No." Qin Shi shook his head and said, "Let me think. It doesn't seem to have any obvious characteristics. But if I can see it, I'll definitely recognize it." Some ores looked very similar, but the spiritual aura they contained was slightly different. It couldn't be explained clearly with words, but if you looked carefully, you could still distinguish them. Mo Chenga was happy but also a bit disappointed. In that case, it was useless for her to be anxious. Qin Shi thought for a while, then said, "You don't need to be anxious. Even if we can't find it for a while, entrusting it to Taoist Kumu and fellow Taoist Tong is the same. They're well informed, so as long as these two things appeared in Kuanzhong City, they definitely won't be able to hide it from them." This was also a way out of desperation. In the end, there was a bit more hope, so Mo Chenga said, "That's good. I'll have to trouble Senior Marshal Brother Shoujing." Qin Shi nodded, then cast a glance at her from the corner of his eyes. He then asked, "What if we can't find it in a short time?" "Without a natal magic weapon, we'll always be a bit weaker. The two things you're looking for are both things that can only be found by chance, not sought." Mo Chenga was also quite hesitant. "I only have one natal magic weapon. I'm not willing to use it randomly." Every core formation cultivator had this kind of mentality. A natal magic weapon was related to one's ability in fights of magical powers. If one randomly chose it, even if it could grow, it would still be slightly inferior to others. Who would be willing to have a lower starting point than others? However, if one wanted a high-grade magic weapon as their natal magic weapon, it would be relatively difficult to find. If they didn't refine it, it would have a greater impact on their ability in fights of magical powers. Qin Shi understood her very well. He nodded and said, "If I hadn't accidentally obtained the refining formula for the 3-yang real fire sword when I was building my foundation, I'm afraid I would have been the same as you." Mo Chenga also felt a bit regretful that she didn't say this earlier. At that time she was wholeheartedly focused on forming her gold core. She always felt that a natal magic weapon was something that should be considered after she formed her gold core, so she didn't take it to heart. The two of them sat each thinking about their own matters. After a while, a foundation building cultivator finally came in and said loudly, "Seniors, fellow Taoists." Everyone's gaze fell on him. They heard him say, "I've made you wait for a long time. Please follow me." Mo Chenga turned to look at Qin Shi. Qin Shi nodded at her. The two of them stood up, followed the flow of people, walked down another aisle and entered another small hall. This small hall was much more exquisite than the previous one. There was an enormous round table in the middle which could seat about 30 people. There were already some people sitting around it. Some people were like them, not wearing any disguises, but most of them were wearing black robes and bamboo hats. Mo Chenga used her divine sense to scan the area. She was greatly surprised to find that this bamboo hat actually blocked her divine sense easily. Qin Shi touched her lightly, then casually chose a seat and signaled her to go over. Mo Chenga looked around and saw that everyone was the same, so she followed the flow. As the two of them sat down, she heard Qin Shi's secret message, Some people here can't be identified, so they're dressed like this. Don't use your divine sense on them at will. Emo Chinga nodded lightly. Although she had been to many places when she was young, she had never had the opportunity to experience a trade fair held by high-level cultivators, so she didn't know about the taboos. After everyone sat down, Emo Chinga roughly looked around and found that there were actually 10 core formation cultivators present, including herself and Qin Shi. In addition, there were also about 10 middle stage and late stage foundation building cultivators. There were only about 20 people in such a secret trade fair, so it must be a rare event. She just didn't know what kind of treasures there were. Before long, someone came in from the side door. His smiling expression looked very frightening. It was Tong Tianyun. Tong Tianyun came in. His gaze swept over Qin Shi and Emo Tienga. He nodded with a smile, then immediately looked away. He said loudly, "I'm Tong Tianyun from Kuanzhong City's Individual Cultivator Alliance. Greetings, fellow Taoists." When a middle-stage core formation cultivator saluted, the foundation building cultivators present didn't dare to accept it no matter how high their status was. They all stood up and saluted him. As for the core formation cultivators, most of them just sat and saluted him back. Tong Tianyun naturally wouldn't fuss about it. After he saluted them, he said with a smile, "Since everyone can come here, you naturally know the rules of the trade fair. I won't say anything more. Let's start." Chapter 266. Tong Tianyun clapped his hands. Immediately, female aura refining cultivators carried several trays covered with red cloths. Since Emo Chinga didn't use her divine sense, she didn't know what was under the red cloths. Presumably, other people were the same, so they all stared at the red cloths silently. After the female aura refining cultivators put down the trays and left, Tong Tianyun said, "Ladies and gentlemen, let's cut to the chase. These treasures are from the collection of the largest shop in Kuanzhong City, 10,000 Treasures House. Please take a look and see if you're interested." Unlike ordinary auctions where the items were presented one by one, Tong Tianyun directly lifted all the red cloths, exposing the items on the 3 trays to everyone. There was a small golden ring, a flame-colored jade, and a jade box. Tong Tianyun opened the jade box and saw a several thousand-year-old snow gall grass inside. This is the Vajra ring. Ladies and gentlemen, don't underestimate it. The collection of 10,000 Treasures House is naturally extraordinary. This ring is a high-grade magic weapon and can be big or small. If you use it freely, it can even split mountains and rocks. Emo Chinga only took a glance at it before looking away. This magic weapon wasn't bad, but it was a bit worse than the 3 magic weapons Lord Taoist Jinghe gave her. Most of the core formation cultivators present weren't interested, but the foundation building cultivators' eyes lit up. This is fire pattern jade. Fellow Taoists who know its value don't need me to introduce it. Emo Chinga had seen it in ancient records. When refining a fire attribute magic weapon, it would increase its power by a lot. She remembered that Qin Shi cultivated a fire attribute cultivation technique, so she turned to look at him. However, she saw that he looked bored and didn't even look at the 3 items. After thinking for a while, she understood. No matter how good this fire pattern jade was, it would be useless after he advanced to the nascent soul realm. This snow gall grass is already 3,000 years old. Everyone is knowledgeable and knows its price, so I won't say much. This was what Emo Chinga was least interested in. 3,000-year-old spiritual plants were everywhere in the virtual sky world. Once Tong Tianyun finished looking, his eyes swept over everyone present, immediately distinguishing who was interested and who wasn't. He smiled and said, "Our trade fair doesn't allow open bidding. Even if it's your first time here, you should know the rules. In the time it takes for an incense stick to burn, everyone should think carefully about what price to offer. Remember, if you're making a bid, you're not allowed to communicate with each other. If you communicate with each other, only one person is allowed to make a bid. Begin now." With a wave of Tong Tianyun's hand, several other aura refining female cultivators carried jade tablets and distributed them to everyone. Each person received 3 tablets, each of which was marked with 3 kinds of items. Emo Chinga was puzzled, but she soon heard Qin Shi's voice. The rule of this trade fair is bidding. Everyone has to put their bid on the jade tablet, and the highest bidder wins. This was something new. In this way, there would be many more variables and there would be less malicious bidding. There wouldn't be a situation where the price would be driven up. Presumably, ordinary cultivators would support this. After all, if the price was driven up, it would be the competitor's loss. Emo Chinga raised her head and swept her gaze over the 20 or so cultivators at the round table. Some were scratching their ears and cheeks, some were immersed in contemplation, and some didn't seem to care. Mo Chenga noticed that there was a person on the opposite side who was like them. He didn't even look at the items on the table. The jade tablet given to him was also placed on the table, untouched. His head was lowered as if he was resting with his eyes closed. Although he seemed to be resting, he was also one of the people wearing black clothes and a bamboo hat, so she couldn't see his expression. Aside from Qin Shi, this person had the highest cultivation level among the people present. He was already in the late stage of the core formation realm. Judging from his indistinct spirit, his fighting ability wasn't weak either. She turned to glance at Qin Shi, but she saw that he was also looking at this person. Mo Chenga sent him a secret voice transmission. Senior Marshal Brother Shoujing, is there something wrong with this person? Qin Shi shook his head lightly. He's just a bit strange. She was about to ask what was strange about it, but the time it takes for an incense stick to burn was up. Tong Tianyun said loudly, "Everyone stop bidding." Upon hearing his words, everyone quieted down. Some people showed a determined expression and quickly wrote their bids. Afterward, the aura-refining female cultivators stepped forward, collected the jade tablets, and gave them all to Tong Tianyun. As Tong Tianyun sorted the jade tablets one by one, most of the people present stared at his movements. After a while, Tong Tianyun smiled and said, "This Vajra ring was won by fellow Taoist number 5 with 8,000 spirit stones. The fire pattern jade was won by fellow Taoist number 18 with 5,000 spirit stones. And the 3,000-year-old snow gall grass was won by fellow Taoist number 11 with 15,000 spirit stones." Mo Chenga was startled by this price. Although she rarely went to market squares, she also knew the prices. This Vajra ring was a magic weapon after all, so 8,000 spirit stones was indeed a bit cheap. As for the fire pattern jade, she didn't know much about it. Presumably, it wasn't a very rare material, so 5,000 spirit stones should be enough. A 3,000-year-old snow gall grass for 15,000 spirit stones was a bit too expensive. After all, Kunwu was right next to a forest. As long as one had the courage to adventure in the south, spiritual plants weren't too rare. Besides, this snow gall grass was an ordinary spiritual plant. It was just a bit older. As if he could see her confusion, he said softly, "After the demonic beast riot, the various cultivation groups in Kunwu haven't recovered their strength yet, so the price of spiritual plants has risen a lot. Moreover, bidding has always been like this. It's possible to buy an item at an extremely low price, but it's also possible to buy it at a much higher price than the market price." Mo Chenga didn't say anything else. From her point of view, these 3 items from the so-called House of 10,000 Treasures weren't anything special. If they were placed among foundation-building cultivators, they would naturally be fought over, but if they were placed among core formation cultivators, they were only ordinary goods. Many people weren't even in the mood to bid. It seemed the main point of this trade fair was still the word, transaction. This auction and bidding were just a warm-up. However, there was always a gaze directed at her from the front, making her feel very uneasy. She raised her head, but she couldn't find the source of the gaze. After the bidding ended, Tong Tianyun told the maids to collect the spirit stones from the successful bidders and trade the goods. Afterward, he also sat down and said with a smile, "All right, the bidding is over. Our trade fair should also officially start. Fellow Taoists, let's start with me, what do you think?" Although it was a question, it was only a formality. Once Tong Tianyun finished speaking, he took out a cloth bag from his robe and poured out a pile of brightly colored stones. Upon seeing these things, the eyes of the disinterested core formation cultivators lit up. As for the foundation building cultivators, their expressions were blank. Obviously they didn't know what these things were. Mo Chenga was ashamed to discover that she also didn't know what they were. It hadn't been long since she became a core formation cultivator, so most of the things she knew came from ancient records. If she hadn't read them, she naturally wouldn't know what they were. "Qin," she said in a low voice, "these are crystal soul jades. I really don't know where old Tong got so many of them." Seeing the interest in his eyes, Mo Chenga couldn't help but ask curiously, "Senior Marshal Brother Shoujing, what's the use of these things?" "Qin," she said, "crystal soul jades are very rare. They're usually used on magic weapons because they can automatically gather spiritual aura. If a magic weapon is embedded with crystal soul jades, it'll automatically absorb spiritual aura. Therefore, magic weapons embedded with crystal soul jades will be more powerful than ordinary magic weapons." Mo Chenga pondered for a moment, then said, "This seems to be a characteristic of crystal jade from the distant past era, correct?" The so-called crystal soul jades are actually flawed crystal jades. In the distant past era, crystal jades were everywhere in the world. Substandard ones were called crystal stones, while flawed ones were called crystal soul jades. Nowadays, crystal jades have long disappeared from the world, and crystal soul jades are also extremely difficult to find. Mo Chinga's heart skipped a beat. Crystal stone? Could it be the crystal stone she read about in the ancient records of the virtual sky world? The crystal stone used by mechanical puppets? It's actually a substandard crystal jade? If that's the case, it's no wonder that the art of engineering was lost. Crystal jades can't be found nowadays, and the same goes for crystal soul jades. It's just that I don't know whether these crystal soul jades are useful or not. Tong Tianyun took out the crystal soul jades and didn't say anything else. Among the core formation cultivators, someone finally couldn't help but ask, "Fellow Taoist Tong, what do you want to exchange these crystal soul jades for?" Tong Tianyun was all smiles. The skin on his face twitched, making him look like a skeleton. "Fellow Taoist, please don't be impatient. I want to exchange them for some spiritual plants, but they have to be 10,000-year-old or older." Once he said that, the expressions of all the core formation cultivators present who weren't wearing bamboo hats changed. One of the men immediately stood up and shouted, 10,000-year-old spiritual plants? Old Tong, why don't you go die? Can you still find 5,000-year-old spiritual plants nowadays? 10,000-year-old spiritual plants. It wasn't strange that this cultivator had such an attitude. 3,000-year-old spiritual plants were already hard to find, let alone 10,000-year-old ones. In this world, 5,000-year-old spiritual plants were most likely extinct. Tong Tianyun was still all smiles, revealing his sinister teeth. He smiled at that man and said, "It's a trade fair after all. It's fine as long as both parties are willing. Fellow Taoist can't take them out, but that doesn't mean others can't, right?" That man couldn't refute him, so he could only let out a heavy humph, and sat back down. Someone else said, "Fellow Taoist Tong, isn't your request a bit too much? What's the value of 10,000-year-old spiritual plants? Do we core formation cultivators even have a chance? I'm afraid nascent soul cultivators would have snatched them long ago." Tong Tianyun was still smiling. "Fellow Taoist, these crystal soul jades of mine are also hard to find in this world. They're not much easier to find than 10,000-year-old spiritual plants." Thus, another person fell silent. "Fellow Taoist Tong, Qin," she said faintly, "I don't have 10,000-year-old spiritual plants you want, but I can give you 100,000 spirit stones and a 5,000-year-old spiritual plant in exchange." Once he said that, not only Mo Chinga but everyone else also looked at him. 100,000 spirit stones wasn't a small amount, even for nascent soul cultivators. Moreover, someone just said they couldn't find 5,000-year-old spiritual plants nowadays, so he took out a 5,000-year-old spiritual plant. However, he didn't cover his face and was wearing Xianqing School's Taoist robe, showing his superior cultivation level, so no one dared to doubt him. Even Tong Tianyun didn't say anything for a while. A chuckle suddenly rang out. It was the core formation cultivator with the highest cultivation level aside from Qinshi that Mo Chinga had noticed. He said in a hoarse voice, "Xianqing School is really rich and overbearing. They can actually afford 100,000 spirit stones and a 5,000-year-old spiritual plant." Qinshi's expression didn't change. He was still calm and composed. "If you can afford a better condition, please don't hesitate to offer it." That person admitted frankly, "I really can't afford your price. However, whether I can get crystal soul jades or not depends on whether fellow Taoist Tong agrees or not." Everyone's gaze shifted to Tong Tianyun. Tong Tianyun once again grinned at Qin Shi, revealing his ghastly teeth. "Fellow Taoist Shojing, I'm really sorry. I only want a 10,000-year-old spiritual plant. I don't want anything else." Qin Shi's expression changed. He said helplessly, "Since that's the case, I have no other choice." Tong Tianyun sighed and asked again, "Is there any fellow Taoist who can use 10,000-year-old spiritual plants to exchange?" Mo Chinga tilted her head to look at him, then sent him a voice transmission. "Senior Marshal Brother Shojing, is this crystal soul jade really so valuable?" Qin Shi answered in a low voice, "It's so much, so it should be worth it. However, 10,000-year-old spiritual plants are too rare. I'm afraid only a few old monsters in this world can take them out." Mo Chinga pondered for a while. When Tong Tianyun was about to give up, she suddenly said, "Fellow Taoist Tong, I do have a 10,000-year-old spiritual plant, but..." Chapter 267. Tong Tianyun's eyes brightened. "Fellow Taoist Qingwei? Everyone's gaze fell on Emo Chenga. Qin Shi even frowned, looking at her with an indescribable expression. Emo Chenga looked calm and continued to say, although fellow Taoist crystal soul jades are also very rare, they're not as rare as 10,000-year-old spiritual plants. This transaction seems a bit unfair. Tong Tianyun was delighted, but his expression soon returned to normal. He said, I spent half a lifetime collecting these crystal soul jades. Not to mention others, even nascent soul seniors wouldn't be able to take out so many crystal soul jades at once. Fellow Taoist Qingwei, please don't ask for too much. Emo Chenga was indeed asking for too much. Qin Shi already told her that so many crystal soul jades were worth exchanging with 10,000-year-old spiritual plants, but his price was only 100,000 spirit stones and a 5,000-year-old spiritual plant. 5,000-year-old spiritual plants were naturally rare in the world, but compared to 10,000-year-old spiritual plants, they were nothing. 100,000 spirit stones was certainly a sky-high price for foundation building cultivators and even ordinary core formation cultivators, but it couldn't make up for the difference in 10,000-year-old spiritual plants. Qin Shi obviously had the same idea. Most importantly, 10,000-year-old spiritual plants could only exist in inaccessible places or secret places like Demonic Mountain. No matter which cultivator accidentally obtained a 10,000-year-old spiritual plant, as long as it appeared, it would soon fall into the hands of a nascent soul cultivator. In that case, even if it had a price, it wouldn't have a market. Emo Chenga was certain that if Tong Tianyun really wanted it, he wouldn't let it go. Besides, she wasn't afraid the transaction wouldn't work. 10,000-year-old spiritual plants were nothing to her. She wanted crystal soul jades because she wanted to know whether they were really related to the art of engineering. Therefore she just smiled. Fellow Taoist Tong, you can't say that. No matter how many crystal soul jades you have, you can always find them if you slowly collect them. 10,000-year-old spiritual plants are different. You can't collect them one leaf at a time. As soon as he said this, many of the people present revealed a smile. There were even some people who laughed out loud and then quickly quieted down. Tong Tianyun didn't speak for a while. His skinny face was expressionless. He originally thought Emo Chenga was someone who just formed her gold core and was still a relative novice. Even if Qin Shoujing was by her side, she still wouldn't have enough confidence. Unexpectedly, she was actually quite astute and bold. She wasn't like other female cultivators from cultivation groups who didn't understand the ways of the world. After thinking for a while, he said, Fellow Taoist Qingwei, if your spiritual plants are good enough, I'm willing to exchange them with other treasures or spirit stones. However, you have to show me the quality of the spiritual plants first. No problem, Emo Chenga readily agreed, but she didn't immediately take out the spiritual plants. Of course, Tong Tianyun was also very astute. He stretched his hand to the side and made an inviting gesture. Fellow Taoist Qingwei, please come with me. His gaze flickered, then he said, Fellow Taoist Shoujing, why don't you be our witness? This was Kuanzhong City after all, and Emo Chenga had a unique treasure on her. If she was alone with him and something happened to her, he wouldn't be able to bear the responsibility. Ever since Master Taoist Qingwei successfully advanced to the core formation realm, her name had already spread to this side. Who didn't know she was Lord Taoist Jinghe's beloved disciple? With the protection of a middle-stage nascent soul cultivator, not to mention him, even the entire Kuanzhong city couldn't afford to offend her. Qin Shi naturally understood. He was indeed a bit worried, so he also smiled and didn't refuse. He also stood up and leisurely followed them into a small door. This was only a small warehouse with half of the goods piled up. A table was placed at the door. Fellow Taoist Qingwei, Tong Tianyun complained as soon as they entered the warehouse. If I knew you had them, why would I bring them to the trade fair? Alas, showing off your wealth isn't a good thing. Emo Chenga smiled. I also didn't know fellow Taoist Tong would need them. What a coincidence. The two of them spoke intimately, but in fact they were just exchanging pleasantries. Once she finished speaking, Emo Chenga took out a jade box from her Qingkuan bag. She knew once the 1,000-year-old chalcedony and Qiyun stone appeared, their prices would be sky-high. She was afraid she didn't have enough spirit stones, so she took some spiritual plants from her virtual sky world. She originally didn't plan to use spiritual plants older than 3,000 years, but after thinking about it, she still brought one with her. She didn't expect to have a use for it. As soon as the jade box was taken out, the spiritual aura couldn't be suppressed. Both Qin Shi and Tong Tianyun stared at the jade box. Tong Tianyun took the jade box and tore off the talisman on it. As soon as he opened it, a strong medicinal fragrance rushed towards him. His eyes widened and he couldn't breathe for a long time. After a long time he finally exhaled slowly. It should be right. It's a 10,000-year-old drunken orchid. He lifted the jade box and sniffed the fragrance. He carefully distinguished the smell and the roots and began to identify the medicinal properties with great proficiency. The rhizome is intact and the medicinal properties are well preserved. Drunken orchid isn't a very rare spiritual plant, but this one must have grown in a place with extremely rich spiritual aura for 10,000 years. It's indeed better than the rare spiritual plants that grow in places with ordinary spiritual aura. Tong Tianyun moved his gaze away from the drunken orchid with difficulty. He closed the jade box and stuck the talisman on it again. He then looked up at Mo Tiange. Fellow Taoist Qingwei, these crystal soul jades are yours. In addition, I have some unique materials here. They aren't very valuable, but they're rare. Consider them my thanks to you. What do you think? Mo Tiange looked down at the bag Tong Tianyun handed her. It was sturdy and contained a lot of things. She gently pushed the bag back. Tong Tianyun's expression changed and became a bit unsightly. Fellow Taoist, you. He thought Mo Tiange was dissatisfied with the price he offered. He said the materials in the bag weren't valuable because he was being modest. As one of the managers of the individual cultivator alliances in Kuanzhong City, he'd been in Kuanzhong City for many years and collected countless strange materials. Normally, he wouldn't yield even if people begged him with 10,000 spirit stones. Tong Tianyun took a deep breath and said, Fellow Taoist Qingwei, name your price. I'll compensate you with spirit stones. Mo Tiange smiled and shook her head. Fellow Taoist Tong, please don't misunderstand. I don't want your spirit stones or materials. Fellow Taoist can use those crystal soul jades to exchange with me. I just want you to promise me one thing. Tong Tianyun was stunned. He didn't expect she would say that. What is it? As a member of the Individual Cultivator Alliance in Kuanzhong City, fellow Taoist Tong must be very well informed about transactions. I happen to be looking for the whereabouts of two kinds of materials, so I hope fellow Taoist Tong can help me inquire about them. Upon hearing this request, a smile appeared on Tong Tianyun's face and he regained his previous amiable attitude. Fellow Taoist Qingwei, what are you talking about? For the sake of fellow Taoist Shoujing, what's wrong with inquiring about the whereabouts of a few materials? You really have to play this kind of joke with me. Mo Tiange smiled. It's my fault. After the two of them finished exchanging the materials, Tong Tianyun asked with concern, Fellow Taoist Qingwei, what are you looking for? Tell me, maybe I'll know now. Then I won't be polite, Mo Tiange said. I'm looking for two kinds of things. One of them is a chalcedony that's more than 1,000 years old. The older, the better. The other kind is a Qiyun stone. I don't have any requirements for it. Fellow Taoist Tong, if you have any information about these two things, please tell me. This. Upon hearing what she said, hesitation flitted across Tong Tianyun's face. He looked at Mo Tiange, then at Qin Shi, who had been leaning against the door and didn't interrupt their conversation. He said, To be honest, I haven't seen a Qiyun stone for many years. As for that 1,000-year-old chalcedony, I saw it once a few days ago, but it was already bought by someone. Mo Tiange was delighted. May I know who the buyer is? Fellow Taoist Tong, do you know? Tong Tianyun shook his head apologetically. Fellow Taoist Qingwei, according to the rules of Kuanzhong City, if the buyer has a request, we absolutely can't divulge the buyer's information. I can't answer this question. Mo Tiange was a bit disappointed. Right after that, she heard Tong Tianyun say, However, fellow Taoist, you've done this old man a big favor. I happen to know the buyer, so I can ask him on your behalf. Mo Tiange originally thought she had no chance, but she didn't expect there would be a turn of events. She said, If that's the case, I'll have to trouble fellow Taoist Tong. Fellow Taoist Tong, you can tell your friend that if he doesn't want to buy it with spirit stones, he can also exchange it with spiritual objects. Tong Tianyun's eyes brightened. Even spiritual plants? Mo Tiange shook her head. Fellow Taoist Tong, 10,000-year-old spiritual plants can only be encountered by luck, not sought. I only have this one. Even if I had a 1,000-year-old spiritual plant, presumably your friend wouldn't care, right? Wealthy core formation cultivators like them indeed didn't care about ordinary 1,000-year-old spiritual plants. Tong Tianyun couldn't help but feel disappointed, but he soon felt relieved. 10,000-year-old spiritual plants naturally couldn't be found everywhere. Being able to find one was already extremely lucky. All right, before we leave, I'll definitely give fellow Taoist an answer. In that case, thank you, fellow Taoist Tong. After the exchange was completed, The three of them returned to the small hall and sat down. Tong Tianyun said, "I've finished my exchange with fellow Taoist Qingwei. Is there any other fellow Taoist who wants to exchange?" Although everyone in the hall was curious about what they wanted to exchange, Tong Tianyun made it clear he wouldn't say anything, so they could only suppress their curiosity. After a while, another core formation cultivator spoke up. He wanted to use a Grand Valiant Stone to exchange for a high-grade medicinal pill like the Clear Sky pill. Normally this exchange would have been very attractive. Grand Valiant Stones were a rare kind of wondrous stone used to cultivate swords. Unfortunately, because this trade fair was shaken by crystal soul jades and 10,000-year-old spiritual plants from the very beginning, it seemed very unattractive. Before long the trade fair ended hastily. During the whole process, many people were absent-minded. Their gazes kept sweeping over the wizened and expressionless Tong Tianyun, or Mo Chenga, who had her eyes drooped as if she was meditating. In the end, Mo Chenga and Qin Shi didn't fancy anything else. Qin Shi, on the other hand, took out a bottle of rare high-grade medicinal pills and said he wanted to buy the news of a 1,000-year-old chalcedony and a Qiyun stone. Sure enough, no one knew about it. Soon after the trade fair ended, everyone went out from the original entrance. There were several entrances to this trade fair. The one Mo Chenga and Qin Shi came in from was public, and there were several other secret entrances for people who didn't want their identities exposed. By the time they returned to the main street, it was already late at night. The two of them were bold and skilled. They didn't hide themselves and just slowly walked towards the small courtyard they were temporarily staying in. The people who came out had already scattered everywhere. In the end, only the two of them were left. The cool and refreshing night breeze blew. On the ground, their clothes fluttered, entangling with each other. Qin Shi suddenly stopped. He grabbed Mo Chenga's wrist and pulled her. In an instant, the two of them flashed several dozen feet away. Qin Shi's line of sight shifted. He coldly stared at a spot in the darkness and said in a heavy voice, "Your Excellency, you've concealed your breath and followed us. What's your intention in the end?" Chapter 268. Mo Chenga focused her gaze and saw a flash of light where they were standing. The bluestone slabs on the ground were all cut, leaving behind a faintly discernible spiritual aura. She was secretly shocked. Her divine sense was always paying attention to the surroundings, but she only sensed the spiritual aura the moment it appeared. If Qin Shi wasn't by her side, she might have been able to escape, but it would have been a lot more dangerous. Core formation cultivators really couldn't be underestimated. Qin Shi finished speaking, and the cultivator's aura finally appeared in their divine sense without any concealment. It was very restrained, but it hid its sharpness deeply. Mo Chenga secretly held the white silk handkerchief in her hand and the square seal magic weapon Lord Taoist Jinghe gave her with her other hand. With the white silk handkerchief in hand, even if this person attacked her, she would be able to resist and then wait for an opportunity to fight back. That person finally came out. It was the late-stage core formation cultivator whose cultivation level was second only to Qin Shi, who sat across from them at the trade fair. Qin Shi pushed her back and sent a private message, "Be careful." Although they were both in the core formation realm, there was a huge difference in strength between early-stage and late-stage core formation cultivators. Mo Chenga knew she hadn't even refined her natal magic weapon and didn't have the ability to show off, so she didn't say much and quietly retreated. That person said in a hoarse voice, "The two of you are really bold. You took out such treasures at the trade fair and actually dared to walk on the street without concealment. Aren't you afraid of being robbed?" Qin Shi sneered and stared at that person. "Robbed? You think you can?" Mo Chenga wrinkled her brows. She always felt that the Qin Shi outside was completely different from the Qin Shi inside the school, who was quiet and only cared about closed-door cultivation. The latter person had a slight shadow of the former senior martial brother Qin, but the former didn't look like him at all. "You're very confident." That person's face under the bamboo hat was hidden in the darkness, but his voice was full of interest. "Everyone says that although Qin Shoujing's talent is ordinary, he's far better than geniuses with single spiritual roots on the road of cultivation. I'm a bit unconvinced." "What does it have to do with me whether you're convinced or not?" Qin Shi's expression remained unchanged. "If you want to fight, please. Otherwise, don't waste our time." That person moved his head and said with a smile, "Fight? Here." When all was said and done, Quanzhong City was a city with a lot of mortals and most of the cultivators were low-level cultivators. If two core formation cultivators fought, it would definitely be a disaster. A slightly mocking smile appeared on Qin Shi's face. "Your Excellency, didn't you already make your move?" Could it be that you've recalled the rule of Kuanzhong City forbidding fights in the city? Rules? The man let out a low, hoarse laugh. Kuanzhong City only has a few core formation individual cultivators. Even if they don't comply, what can they do? These words were really arrogant. There weren't just 1 or 2 individual cultivators in Kuanzhong City, but 7 of them. This person disregarded the rules of Kuanzhong City like this. Could it be that he could fight 1 against 7? Besides, she'd seen Tong Tianyun's divine sense and Taoist Kumu's means. Since she could see through them, they must be extremely powerful. Could it be that this person's vision was even higher than Shi's? Taking a step back, between her and Shi, one was in the early stage of the core formation realm, while the other was in the peak stage of the core formation realm. Shi was only in the late stage of the core formation realm, so how could he possibly fight 1 against 2? That was what Mo Chenga was thinking, but in the next moment she suddenly saw a flash of sword light. That black-robed cultivator had made his move. Shi had long anticipated this. He raised his left hand and a golden light sprang from his arm. The 3-yang real fire sword appeared in the golden light. He flipped his hand, and the 3-yang real fire sword soared high into the sky, forming a wall of fire that completely blocked that black-robed cultivator's sword aura. Seeing that Shi easily blocked his sword aura, the black-robed cultivator tilted his head with a strange expression on his face. He was about to say something, but Shi didn't give him the chance. He gathered extremely pure flame-colored spiritual aura in his right hand and pushed it lightly. The 3-yang real fire sword burst out with dazzling light and pounced on that person. In a hurry, the black-robed cultivator put his palms together and unsheathed the long sword on his back. The sword aura was extremely sharp and scattered sword light. This person was obviously a sword cultivator without a doubt. With such momentum, if he wasn't a sword cultivator, how could he have such a sharp sword aura? Tinga. Shi suddenly turned his head and shouted. Sword aura had no eyes, so Mo Chenga knew what he meant. In an instant, she waved the white silk handkerchief, turning it into a mist that enveloped her. The mist was hazy and no spiritual aura could be seen. The sword aura was sharp, but it disappeared without a trace when it encountered the mist. The fact that even she could block his sword aura so easily startled the black-robed cultivator. Before he could withdraw his sword, Shi's sword had already arrived. He hastily pulled his sword back to block it. With a muffled sound, the sword aura and spiritual aura between the 2 swords collided and exploded with a loud bang. A fight of magical power between 2 core formation cultivators who were both very good at destructive means. How terrifying was the spiritual aura pressure produced. In an instant, the street was already in a mess. The bluestone slabs were broken inch by inch, and the street was beyond recognition. If the street wasn't wide, the shops on both sides probably wouldn't have been able to escape this disaster. As soon as the spiritual aura exploded, several flight lights flew out from the tallest tower in Kuanzhong City, flying in their direction. Shi and Mo Chenga didn't move, and neither did the black-robed cultivator. Kuanzhong City wasn't big, so the flight lights arrived in a flash. They were 3 core formation cultivators and the leader was Tong Tianyun. Fellow Taoists, you. Tong Tianyun was surprised to see them. Shi glanced at Tong Tianyun, then raised his hand to withdraw his 3-yang real fire sword. He said, Fellow Taoist Tong, you came at the right time. This person has been following us since we came out of the trade fair, and he even launched a sneak attack on us. I don't know what his intentions are. Tong Tianyun was even more surprised. He stared at the black-robed cultivator. You. Although he only said one word, Mo Chenga had a bad premonition. Judging from Tong Tianyun's expression, he seemed to know this person. When the black-robed cultivator saw Tong Tianyun and the others coming, he laughed and took off his bamboo hat. He had a very young face, equivalent to a young man of 24 or 25 years old. He was clean and elegant, not as good as Shi, but the tips of his eyebrows and the corners of his eyes carried the color of spring. His face was like a peach blossom, and as his eyes moved, he seemed to be full of affection. When Shi saw this face, he immediately frowned and said in a muffled voice, It's you. The youth smiled. Isn't it me? His smile made Shi even more unhappy. Since you're here, why didn't you come to see us directly? Why did you sneak attack us? The youth waved his hand and put his sword back into its sheath. He then fanned himself with the bamboo hat in his hand and said frivolously, It's because of you. His eyes flashed. He stared at Mo Chenga with his watery eyes and smiled. Miss, are you Lord Taoist Jinghe's last disciple, Master Taoist Qingwei? I'm Jing Xingji, a cultivator from Gujian sect. I've heard a lot about you. Jing Xingji? A cultivator from Gujian sect? Qin Shi said they were waiting for a cultivator from Gujian sect here. Could it be this person? She saluted him and said faintly, I'm Mo Qingwei. Greetings to fellow Daoist Jing. Jing Xingji was stunned to see that she wasn't moved in the slightest by his attentive attitude. He then smiled even more brilliantly. So it's Miss Mo. When I first heard Miss Mo formed her gold core at such a young age and was called a genius among geniuses, I thought people were exaggerating. Now that I've met you, Miss Jing Xingji, Qin Shi bluntly called his name and showed his displeasure on his face. Fellow Taoist Tong and the others are still here. Why are you fawning over my junior martial sister without an explanation? Jing Xingji's smile became even more cheerful. He blinked his peach blossom eyes and said, Qin Shoujing, why are you in such a hurry? Fellow Taoist Tong doesn't have any objections. You're wasting our time. Qin Shi glared at him coldly, then turned to Tong Tianyun and the other two. He cupped his hands and said, Fellow Taoist Tong, I've already explained the situation. If you want to kill or punish us, you should ask fellow Taoist Jing. Junior martial sister and I will take our leave first. He then turned around and left, looking as if he didn't want to stay even a second longer. Mo Qingge didn't have time to say anything. She nodded at Tong Tianyun, then hurriedly followed him. Tong Tianyun didn't stop them. Although they had a fight of magical powers in the city and many things were damaged, it didn't seem like there were any casualties, so it wasn't a serious incident. However, when he turned around, he saw Jing Xingji staring in the direction the two of them left with a faint smile on his face. Tong Tianyun couldn't help but remind him with a smile, Fellow Taoist Jing, I have to advise you that fellow Taoist Shoujing isn't in a good mood this time. It's best not to provoke him. Qin Shi and Mo Qingge's silhouettes disappeared. Jing Xingji's gaze shifted and he asked with a smile, Why is that? Isn't Qin Shoujing unmoved by anything? Why is he in a bad mood? Tong Tianyun said, No matter who he is, he must be in a bad mood after failing to form his nascent soul 3 times, right? Jing Xingji nodded, but then he blinked again. You're right, but I think there's another reason why he's in a bad mood, right? Hee. Tong Tianyun pretended not to understand his gaze and said, I don't know about this. If fellow Taoist Jing wants to know, why don't you ask fellow Taoist Shoujing? Jing Xingji shook his head. I'm not stupid. Can I ask him? If I ask a few more questions, his 3 young real fire sword will come to cut me. Could it be that fellow Taoist Jing is afraid? Tong Tianyun was obviously trying to provoke him, but Jing Xingji was also frank. He shrugged and said, Fellow Taoist Tong, don't provoke me. I admit that in terms of fights of magical powers, although I'm a sword cultivator, I'm not as good as him. However, maybe I really can surpass him in the matter of forming my nascent soul. Tong Tianyun's gaze flickered. Fellow Taoist Jing, you're really confident. Could it be that you already have hope in forming your nascent soul? What are you talking about? Jing Xingji wasn't stupid. Once he saw Tong Tianyun's expression, he immediately pushed the blame away. Didn't Qin Shoujing fail to form his nascent soul 3 times? Presumably he won't be able to form his nascent soul in a short time. If I work harder and succeed in forming my nascent soul in 1 try, won't I be able to surpass him? Hee. Tong Tianyun chuckled and said, It seems fellow Taoist Jing is very confident in this trip to Demonic Mountain. I can't say I'm confident, I just made a few extra preparations. Jing Xingji looked at Tong Tianyun and said meaningfully, Isn't fellow Taoist Tong the same? Presumably, fellow Taoist Tong has a well-thought-out plan for this trip to Demonic Mountain. Tong Tianyun pretended not to understand what Jing Xingji said and changed the subject. Fellow Taoist Jing, since you're here, let's meet up tomorrow. We've already been delayed for a while. If the restrictions on Demonic Mountain disappear early, we'll suffer a huge loss. Right? Jing Xingji was all smiles. Since that's the case, I'll go back and rest first. Fellow Taoist Tong, see you tomorrow. Hey! Tong Tianyun stopped him. He was also all smiles. Fellow Taoist Jing, you disregarded our Kuanzhong city's rules and fought in the city, causing trouble and breaking things. Shouldn't you pay for it? Chapter 269. Qin Shi was in a very bad mood. Upon realizing this, Mo Qingge returned to the courtyard she was temporarily staying in and was about to return to her room. Unexpectedly, Qin Shi said from behind her, Wait. His tone right now couldn't be considered good, but he obviously suppressed his emotions, so Mo Qingge stopped and said with a calm attitude, Senior Marshal Brother Shoujing, is there anything else? Qin Shi hesitated for a moment before he said, "Regarding today's matter, I still have to tell you." Startled, Mo Chenga asked, "Senior Marshal Brother, could it be that you think it's a bit inappropriate for me to take out treasures like this?" Qin Shi shook his head. "We're not individual cultivators without any foundation. We have a school and a master to back us up, so taking out some treasures once in a while isn't a big deal. On the contrary, it would only make people feel that our Xianqing school isn't to be trifled with." "Then, is there anything else?" Qin Shi's probing gaze swept over her face. He asked, "A 10,000-year-old spiritual plant? Could it be a gift from your ancestor?" "Correct." Mo Chenga had long thought about how to answer this question, so her answer was very straightforward. Qin Shi nodded. This was the only answer he could think of. "Is this what Senior Brother wants to say?" "Of course not," Qin Shi said. "What I want to talk to you about is Jing Xingji." "What's the problem with fellow Daoist Jing?" Qin Shi hesitated for a moment then said, "I've known this person since I formed my gold core. He was the disciple of Venerable Swordsman Zhongguang of Gujin sect. However, Venerable Swordsman Zhongguang already passed away 100 years ago, so the status of his disciples in Gujin sect is quite awkward. Because this Jing Xingji was treated unfairly in the sect, his temperament is quite strange. He loves to provoke female cultivators, but in fact he doesn't want to take responsibility." "Senior Marshal Brother Shoujing, are you worried I'll be bewitched by this person?" Before he could finish, Mo Chenga interrupted him and said bluntly. She said the word confused so bluntly, causing Qin Shi's face to slightly redden. He turned his head away somewhat uncomfortably. "I was just reminding you." The corners of Mo Chenga's mouth twitched. She finally smiled and said, "Thank you for your kind advice, Senior Marshal Brother. Can I go back and rest now?" With an awkward expression, Qin Shi nodded. Mo Chenga then turned around and went back into the house. Once she returned to her room, Mo Chenga sat down and rubbed the space between her eyebrows. She admitted that she was a little unhappy just now. How could she be such a shallow person? No matter how beautiful Jing Xingji was, or how sweet his tongue was, it was none of her business. But Qin Shi's advice was after all because he cared about her, so she calmed down after thinking about it. In fact, when they met again 35 years later, she still couldn't figure out what Qin Shi was thinking. She knew from a cultivator's point of view, Qin Shi treated her extremely well. When she was injured in the 10,000 Laws of Nature formation, he went out to look for medicine for her. On the trip to Demonic Mountain, her cultivation level was obviously low, but he was still willing to take her along. She did not know if this was the affection of her senior martial brother Qin who had gone through thick and thin with her, or the care of her father's friend, Immortal Shou Jing for the younger generation. However, it was one thing to feel sentimental. Logically, she did not want to spend too much time with senior brother Shoujing. Or perhaps she had been too competitive all her life. When she was young, she was better educated than Tianjun and the other boys. Later on, she always wanted to cultivate to become an immortal, and was unwilling to indulge in cultivation just because she was a female cultivator. Later on, she finally made a name for herself. She had talents and a master. But at that time she was even more unwilling to indulge herself. She wholeheartedly regarded those genius cultivators as her goal. Now, it wasn't that she didn't have any regrets in her heart. If it had always been that senior martial brother Qin, maybe she would have spoken her heart and asked for a future for herself. But, he wasn't only senior martial brother Qin, but he was also immortal Shou Jing. She was unwilling to look up to a person like this and become a little woman under his protection. Besides, she also couldn't understand his thoughts. He was a person with a firm Dao heart, so he most likely never thought about dual cultivation. If she let go of her feelings too much and ended up like Wei Jiaxi or Ruan Mingzhu, what would she do? She admitted she was timid and didn't dare to pursue it as persistently as them because her final goal was still to achieve the great Dao. She was unwilling to give up for anything. So let it be. However, ever since they left the mountain, this senior martial brother Shoujing's attitude towards her, although he still took care of her in every aspect, was clearly resentful. She was puzzled. What was he resentful about? Was it because he went out to look for medicine and got seriously injured? With his mental state and cultivation level, he shouldn't be like this. Since she couldn't understand things, she simply put them at the back of her mind. Mo Chenga disguised herself outside, then entered the virtual sky world. She put the crystal soul jades she got from the trade fair in the virtual sky world first and kept the two stone sculpture puppets by her side. Although the cultivation levels of these two puppets were only in the late stage of the foundation building realm, they were very strong and might come in handy. Then there were the two spiritual beasts, Xiaohua and Feifei. These days she had been raising them in the virtual sky world. The two spiritual beasts accompanied each other, sometimes fighting and sometimes playing. They had a very good relationship. Moreover, when she was in closed-door meditation to form her gold core, she also made them cultivate seriously. Xiaohua was now in the peak of the 4th rank and was about to break through to the 5th rank. Feifei was a bit behind and had just reached the 4th rank. Spiritual beasts' realm breakthroughs weren't as troublesome as human cultivators. They didn't need to cultivate their mental state and didn't need to go through inner demons, so it was much simpler. Mo Chinga herself didn't have much use for the spiritual plants in the virtual sky world, so she always let them eat them whenever they wanted. In this virtual sky world, Xiaohua and Feifei had endless spiritual plants and rich spiritual aura, so their cultivation speed was many times faster than other spiritual beasts. Feifei didn't have any offensive skills, so it couldn't advance to the 5th rank for a while. Ever since Mo Chinga discovered Xiaohua's fire spells were very powerful and could definitely become a fighting spiritual beast, she deliberately cultivated it. Not only did she let it eat the spiritual plants in the virtual sky world, but she also specially concocted constitution-enhancing pills for it to advance. Just as she was about to go to the other bamboo room she used as a spiritual beast room to see how the two spiritual beasts were doing, she saw Feifei running in from the outside, throwing itself at her and grabbing her hem. Mo Chinga bent down, picked Feifei up and patted its head. "What's wrong? Did you cultivate properly?" Feifei whimpered twice and tugged at her clothes, trying to pull her out. Mo Chinga was confused. "What's the matter?" Feifei shook its head as if it was nodding, but it kept looking in the direction of the spiritual beast room. Mo Chinga frowned and walked towards the spiritual beast room with Feifei in her arms. Xiaohua was in the middle of a realm breakthrough. Did something happen? Judging from the spiritual aura fluctuation, there was nothing unusual. When she arrived outside the spiritual beast room and pushed the door open, she saw Xiaohua nestled in the corner, curled up and cultivating. Its eyes were closed and its body was covered in a fiery red spiritual aura, dyeing the whole room blood red. Feifei barked again, but it didn't dare to disturb Xiaohua. It just circled around it twice, then ran back to grab her hem. Mo Chinga carefully sensed it, then smiled and lowered her body to stroke Feifei's head. "Don't worry, Xiaohua's about to advance. Let's not disturb it." Feifei seemed to be a bit confused, but seeing that she was comforting it, it obediently followed her out and returned to the main room. The red light on Xiaohua's body was its fire spiritual aura. With such strong fire spiritual aura, it was obvious that it had successfully advanced and was now in the stage of stabilizing its realm. Mo Chinga was delighted. If Xiaohua could successfully advance to the 5th rank with its unique sun-real fire, it would definitely be able to help her. In that case she would also have one more means to protect herself. In the next few days, Mo Chinga even refused to meet with her companions and focused on guarding the virtual sky world, waiting for Xiaohua to finish its advancement. The advancement of spiritual beasts was much easier than that of human cultivators. Xiaohua's advancement was already successful. As long as its spiritual aura was stable, it would be a 5th rank spiritual beast. 5 days later, before they left, Xiaohua finally finished its advancement and came out of the spiritual beast room. At that time, Qin Shi also told her it was time to leave for Demonic Mountain. Mo Chinga left Feifei in the virtual sky world and took Xiaohua out. She then packed up all her things and went to see Qin Shi. Qin Shi was in the hall. Although he was holding a teacup, he didn't move. His gaze fell on the void and no one knew what he was thinking. His divine sense sensed her coming in, so he turned his head and his gaze fell on Xiaohua. A look of surprise flashed across his face. "Xiaohua, advanced?" Mo Chinga nodded. "I advanced not long ago." "Oh." Qin Shi looked at Xiaohua with a strange expression. During the more than 20 years she wasn't in Shenqing school, Xiaohua followed Yi Zhenji, and Yi Zhenji lived in his immortal's cave. In those more than 20 years, Xiaohua started to have medicinal pills concocted by her. Later, when those medicinal pills ran out, he wasn't stingy and never stopped giving medicinal pills to Xiaohua just like before. Kunwu cultivators never raised spiritual beasts so extravagantly. Even nascent soul cultivators rarely treated spiritual beasts this generously. Moreover, spiritual beasts worthy of such treatment were all rare breeds. If other people knew that the inferno beasts, which could be found everywhere in Kunwu, were raised like this, they would probably want to dig out all the medicinal pills Xiaohua ate. Xiaohua was also strange. Many low-level cultivators also raised inferno beasts, but none of them had mutated like Xiaohua. Now, what Qin Shi found even more strange was that in the more than 20 years Xiaohua ate medicinal pills all the time, it only advanced from the second rank to the third rank. Now, in the same amount of time, Xiaohua unexpectedly advanced to the fifth rank. Qin Shi also had spiritual beasts, but he rarely used them to fight. Nevertheless, he knew how difficult it was to raise spiritual beasts. He had a Chongming bird that he raised for more than 100 years, but it was only in the fifth rank now. Although he didn't raise it as much as Xiaohua, he still fed it with medicinal pills. Nevertheless, Xiaohua advanced to the fifth rank in such a short period of time. His intuition told him something was wrong. Suspicions arose in his heart, but when he thought about it carefully, he found even more doubts. Master said Tiange's pill concocting skills were very good. Just like that time when he saw Jinji feeding Xiaohua medicinal pills, they were refined to perfection. But what was even more astonishing was that those medicinal pills were actually made from 1,000-year-old spiritual plants. Even if she received many spiritual plants from a deification cultivator 60 years ago, she shouldn't be this extravagant, right? Her pill concocting skills must be the result of concocting many medicinal pills, but where did she get those medicinal plants? His pill concocting skills were the best in all of Clear Spring Peak. Master saw that he had a talent for pill concocting, so he deliberately trained him. Usually, whenever there were spiritual plants, they were always sent to him. What about her? Where did she get so many spiritual plants to practice? Moreover, she seemed to rarely ask the steward's hall to collect spiritual plants. Mo Tiange was scared by his gaze. She couldn't help but ask, "Senior Marshal Brother Shoujing, aren't we leaving?" Qin Shi regained his train of thought and stood up. "Then let's go." Watching him walk out of the small courtyard, Mo Tiange was full of questions. She put Xiaohua back into her spiritual beast bag and followed him out. Chapter 270. Several rays of light with astonishing momentum swept across Kuanzhong City, startling countless cultivators and making them raise their heads to look at them. "This is the aura of a core formation cultivator," a cultivator muttered to himself as he looked at the colorful streaks of light converging in the sky. 1, 2, 3, 4. There were actually 7 core formation cultivators gathered together, causing the low-level cultivators to be both envious and shocked. In the restaurant, someone bared his teeth and spat on the ground. Baring his teeth, he looked at the flying sleeves and the dazzling lights in the sky and shouted, "Damn it! I wish I could be as awesome as you." The cultivators at the table next to him turned to look at him. He was just a strong man in the 4th layer of the aura refining realm. His clothes were ordinary and his cultivation level was even more ordinary. The cultivators at the table mocked him. "You? Why don't you look at what kind of aptitude you have? Each and every one of these core formation seniors is a heavenly genius. When they were your age, they'd already reached the foundation establishment stage." The muscular man rolled his eyes. He didn't want to argue with this person and said confidently, "I was just joking. Core formation. I'll thank the heavens and earth if I can reach the foundation establishment stage." These words resonated with most of the low-level cultivators in the restaurant. Most of them were just itinerant cultivators. Let alone core formation, they couldn't even reach foundation establishment. "Sigh, when will I be able to form my gold core too?" The group of cultivators looked at the ray of light in midair with envy. Fellow Taoist Shoujing, fellow Taoist Qingwei. In midair, Taoist Kumu greeted them, who were the last to arrive. All 7 of them had arrived. Qin Shi swept his gaze over them, then returned the greeting. "Fellow Taoist Kumu, fellow Taoists." Taoist Kumu and Tong Tianyun smiled and cupped their hands. Madame Feng was treading on a lotus leaf-shaped flying magic tool, ignoring them. Jing Xingji looked at them with a faint smile. Lei Dongqing was still holding his wine jar. He said anxiously, "You two are so slow. We've been waiting for a long time. Let's go, let's go." "Fellow Taoist Lei, what's the rush?" Taoist Kumu said with a smile. "It takes half a year to a year for the restrictions on Demonic Mountain to slowly weaken and disappear. It's only been 2 or 3 months since we got the news. When we arrive at Demonic Mountain, we still have to wait." "That's hard to say," Lei Dongqing said. "What if it was opened earlier? You'll just be following behind others and picking up scraps." Old Lei is right. Madame Feng's gaze was cold, completely different from her flirtatious appearance that day. "When we reach Demonic Mountain, we still have a lot of things to do. Let's go." Both of them were in such a hurry, and the others didn't have any objections, so Taoist Kumu said, "In that case, let's go." The 7 cultivators used their own methods to form a formation and flew toward the east. Taoist Kumu was riding a red-crowned crane, Tong Tianyun's flying magic weapon was like a canoe, Madame Fong was stepping on a lotus leaf, and Lei Dongqing was sitting on top of a wine jar. Mo Chenga couldn't help but get goosebumps all over her body when she recalled that he held a wine jar and drank from it every day. Jing Xingji was naturally riding a flying sword, while Qin Shi was riding a flying cloud. She didn't ride Qin Shi's flying cloud like she did when she came here. Instead, she took out the white silk handkerchief and used it as a flying magic weapon. Among the 7 of them, Qin Shi's flying cloud, Jing Xingji's flying sword, and Tong Tianyun's canoe were the fastest. Mo Chenga could keep up with them fairly easily, but the others weren't weak either. Although they were just hurrying, it was also a way to evaluate each other. Madame Fong was a bit surprised to see Mo Chenga easily keeping up with everyone, so she took a second look at her. Fellow Taoist Qingwei. Sitting in the canoe, Tong Tianyun was the most relaxed, so he came over to talk to Mo Chenga. Mo Chenga tilted her head to look at him. Fellow Taoist Tong, what's the matter? Tong Tianyun said, I've already asked about that matter. My friend said that since we're going to Demonic Mountain, he hopes fellow Taoist Qingwei can exchange a mystical object from Demonic Mountain for it. Mo Chenga was a bit stunned. What does that mean? Tong Tianyun smiled and said, to tell you the truth, fellow Taoist Qingwei, my friend is also like me. He doesn't have much time left in his life, and because of his clan, it's inconvenient for him to go to Demonic Mountain with us. He bought the chalcedony to concoct medicinal pills, but it's not that he absolutely needs it. There's a unique spiritual object on Demonic Mountain that's very useful to him. If fellow Taoist Qingwei's lucky and can get that spiritual object, my old friend is willing to exchange it for a chalcedony. Mo Chenga paused for a moment, then said, fellow Taoist Tong, this transaction isn't fair. Which spiritual object on Demonic Mountain isn't extremely rare? Although chalcedonies older than 1,000 years are rare, their value is far from comparable. Besides, after entering Demonic Mountain, it's really too difficult to get a specific spiritual item. Tong Tianyun stroked his beard with a smile and said, the value of an object depends on its demand. If it's needed, it's worth it no matter how big the price is. Fellow Taoist Qingwei, you understand this principle, right? Mo Chenga naturally understood this. Otherwise, she wouldn't have asked the steward's hall to buy those materials at sky-high prices. But understanding was one thing. She naturally couldn't let herself suffer too much during the transaction. Fellow Taoist Tong is right, but I wonder how much your friend needs this spiritual object? This. Tong Tianyun paused for a moment, then shook his head with a smile. Fellow Taoist Qingwei, with your Xianqing school's wealth, why do you need to compete with individual cultivators like us for petty profits? Rest assured, the spiritual object my friend mentioned isn't too difficult to find. In terms of value, it's a bit higher than 1,000-year-old chalcedony, but if fellow Taoist urgently needs chalcedonies, it won't be too much of a loss. Mo Chenga thought for a moment, then chose to take a step back. Alright, fellow Taoist Tong, tell me what you're looking for first. If I happen to find it on this trip, I'll submit the transaction. If I can't find it, I can only drop the subject. Tong Tianyun nodded. That's good. I'll be able to give an explanation to my old friend. The two of them then continued to hurry on with their journey, exchanging a few words from time to time. Because the two of them were using secret voice transmissions, the others didn't know what they were talking about. Only Jing Xingji glanced at them with a smile. Mo Chenga saw that his face was like a peach blossom and his eyes had a soul-stirring look, so she felt disgusted and turned her head to ignore him. Jing Xingji, however, wasn't annoyed. He still showed a faint smile, then turned his head to follow Taoist Kumu. The next few days were boring journeys. There were often cultivators flying at high speed like them in the sky. Lower-level cultivators all avoided them when they saw so many core formation cultivators. When they occasionally ran into cultivators in the same realm as them, they couldn't help but greet them, but they still went their separate ways. Compared to foundation building and aura refining cultivators, core formation cultivators were obviously much more indifferent, or perhaps they were much more arrogant. Those who could cultivate to the core formation realm were either extremely talented or had great fated chances. Which one of them didn't look down on ordinary cultivators? Those with higher statuses were elders of large sections. Those with lower statuses were doing very well even in small sections. If they were vagrant cultivators, they were even more impressive. Vagrant cultivators who were able to cultivate to the core formation realm were all outstanding. However, in these past few days, Mo Chenga got along well with Taoist Kumu and Tong Tianyun. Even Madame Fong, who probably didn't find her so displeasing to the eye anymore, would occasionally say a few words to her. Mo Chenga, who originally cut the queue halfway, gradually blended into this small core formation team. But when they were taking a break, she secretly pulled her back. Junior Marshal Sister Qingwei. These past few days, Mo Chenga had adapted to the way he called her. If he called her Chenga, it meant he was in a good mood. If he called her Junior Marshal Sister Qingwei, it meant he wanted to distance himself from her. Mo Chenga thought about it and felt very helpless. Why was this senior martial brother Shoujing even more unhappy than her after the truth was revealed? With his mental state and cultivation level, he shouldn't be like this, right? Mo Chenga's eyes wandered, but she didn't answer. She frowned and called her again, Junior Marshal Sister Qingwei? He slightly raised his voice, startling Mo Chenga back to her senses. Mo Chenga was a bit annoyed when she realized she was distracted. This wasn't a good habit for cultivators. Senior Marshal Brother Shoujing, what's the matter? She glanced at her and said faintly, Junior Marshal Sister, you seem to have a good relationship with them these days? Them? Daoist Kumu and the others? Mo Chenga said, we were just chatting. What's wrong with that? Nothing. I just wanted to tell you that you'd better keep your distance from them. And? Mo Chenga was puzzled. Since we're companions, shouldn't we communicate more? I don't know them at all. If we don't communicate, it'll be hard for us to have a tacit understanding. She raised the corner of his mouth somewhat mockingly. If it was in the past, it wouldn't be a big deal. But do you remember what happened before we left? That old Tong exchanged a 10,000-year-old spiritual plant from you? Mo Chenga nodded. Yes, what's wrong with that? Of course, it's very problematic. She said faintly, a 10,000-year-old spiritual plant isn't something ordinary core formation cultivators can afford. With Kuanzhong City's strength, there's no nascent soul cultivator behind them. If they had a 10,000-year-old spiritual plant, they'd be bullied by nascent soul cultivators sooner or later. That day at the trade fair, Old Tong directly said he wanted to exchange for a 10,000-year-old spiritual plant, so this matter must have been leaked. The core formation cultivators of the individual cultivator alliance in Kuanzhong City are all shrewd. How could they make this kind of mistake? Moreover, he exchanged for a 10,000-year-old spiritual plant and went to Demonic Mountain with us. It's impossible for him to concoct a 10,000-year-old spiritual plant into medicinal pills in such a short time. Mo Chenga thought for a moment and was a bit surprised. Then what's fellow Daoist Tong's purpose in exchanging for a 10,000-year-old spiritual plant? I don't know. She shook his head and asked her, did he and Daoist Kumu talk to you about anything these past few days? Nothing. Mo Chenga thought carefully. It's nothing more than some miscellaneous things in Kunwu. It seems there's nothing special. Right, the two of them seemed very confident about the trip to Demonic Mountain. She smiled, but his gaze was even more determined. That's right. A 10,000-year-old spiritual plant isn't used to concoct medicinal pills. It's not used to concoct medicinal pills? Mo Chenga was a bit confused. Then what else can it be used for? To give gifts. Gifts. Mo Chenga thought for a moment and understood. To a nascent soul cultivator? She nodded. It's very likely. After a pause he said slowly, maybe in the beginning they didn't think they could get a 10,000-year-old spiritual plant. Maybe they just wanted to use those crystal soul jades to exchange for something from a nascent soul cultivator. Although crystal soul jades aren't as rare as 10,000-year-old spiritual plants, collecting so many of them isn't much easier than finding 10,000-year-old spiritual plants. I'm afraid Old Tong didn't collect them by himself. Instead, he gathered the strength of Kuanzhong City. Then what's their purpose? Maybe they wanted to exchange for something. Shi frowned. He thought for a while and shook his head. In the end, it's just my guess. I don't have any solid evidence. You just need to be more careful on the way. And? Mo Chenga answered. She thought to herself that as a core formation cultivator she really had a lot of things to learn. She deduced such a possibility based on a few clues. Regardless of whether it was true or not, at least he could raise his vigilance and avoid some dangers. Chapter 271. Right. Mo Chenga thought for a moment then said, Tong Tianyun said his friend wanted me to exchange a spiritual object I might find on Demonic Mountain for a 1,000-year-old chalcedony. A spiritual object on Demonic Mountain? Unsurprisingly, a mocking expression also appeared on Shi's face. Their plan is very clever. How dangerous is it to go to Demonic Mountain? It's merely a 1,000-year-old chalcedony, yet they want to obtain what they want through your hands? Mo Chenga said, they're not the only ones who have 1,000-year-old chalcedony. It's fine to wait. However, the most important thing right now is the trip to Demonic Mountain, so I won't bargain with them. If we can really get that spiritual object and come back safely, it won't be too late to discuss this matter. If we're unlucky. She didn't continue. Demonic Mountain was a dangerous place, not to mention the place where her father died. Even if Qin went there once and was fully prepared this time, it still wasn't foolproof. Qin frowned and said coldly, "Since I'm taking you there, I'll naturally bring you back safely. You don't need to worry." Mo Chenga was rendered speechless by his words. She didn't mean that, so why did he? Just as she thought about it, she heard Qin say, "What do they want?" Mo Chenga collected her scattered thoughts and said, "It's something called heavenly aromatic bean." Tong Tianyun said it's originally a kind of spiritual panacea. Its fruit looks like a bean, but after it ripens it'll break away from its roots and leaves, becoming extremely hard like a stone. This kind of thing rarely appears in the world, but a lot of them were found on Demonic Mountain. Qin frowned and didn't say anything for a long time. Judging from his expression, there seemed to be something wrong, so Mo Chenga asked, "What's wrong?" After a long while, Qin finally said, "I'm afraid old Tong's friend cultivates some kind of side path. Heavenly aromatic bean really isn't precious and has no use for ordinary cultivators. If we can find it, it won't be too bad to exchange it for 1,000-year-old chalcedony. But the use of heavenly aromatic bean is—" He hesitated for a long time but didn't say it, as if there was something difficult to say. Mo Chenga didn't understand, so she asked again, "What use does it have?" Qin turned his head and said as calmly as he could, "Heavenly aromatic beans can be used to concoct a kind of medicinal pill. It has a miraculous effect on people performing dual cultivation." Mo Chenga thought about it and felt even more baffled. "But there's nothing special about it, right?" The Tao of alchemy was filled with all sorts of oddities. There were pill recipes for every situation. Cultivators who practiced dual cultivation would naturally have pills suitable for them. Faced with her doubtful gaze, Qin looked even more distressed. After a long time he finally squeezed out a few words. "This isn't an ordinary medicinal pill, it's an aphrodisiac. Fellow Taoist Shoujing, fellow Taoist Qingwei." Taoist Kumu's voice rang out from afar, breaking the strange silence. The two of them raised their heads and saw Taoist Kumu waving at them. "It's time for us to go." The two of them felt as if they had been pardoned. They each controlled their flying treasures and approached the group. Although she knew she should pretend nothing had happened, she still couldn't help but put some distance between them. After several days of getting along, Madame Feng treated Mo Chenga a bit more kindly. Seeing her like this, she felt a bit strange and asked, "What happened?" Mo Chenga was speechless for a moment, but when she saw Jing Xingji glancing at her with a faint smile on his face, she felt even more depressed. She could only answer gloomily, "It's nothing. I just heard my master has arrived at Mount Yuheng, so I'm a bit anxious." Madame Feng didn't doubt her words. She felt a bit envious and said, "Sister, with your talent and your current age, there seems to be no need for you to risk your life on Demonic Mountain, right? Why do you three have to go?" Mo Chenga was silent for a while, then said, "I'm going to Demonic Mountain to settle an old matter." "Old matter?" Madame Feng was about to ask again, but she saw Mo Chenga turning her head away. She seemed to be full of worries, so she didn't say anything. Seeing that the two of them seemed to be much closer, Lei Dongqing shouted loudly, "Woman Feng, didn't you dislike this little girl? How come it's only been a few days but you're already so good?" Seeing that it was him, Madame Feng snorted coldly and said, "No matter how much I dislike others, they're still better than you. Go to the side, you're annoying." Lei Dongqing touched his nose, but he only muttered, "Fierce woman." Mo Chenga couldn't help but purse her lips and smile. These two people were quite interesting. Madame Feng obviously wasn't old. She looked to be in her early 20s and she was a bright and beautiful woman, but this Lei Dongqing called her Woman Feng. Although Lei Dongqing was a bald man and looked a bit ugly, he looked like he was in his 30s, but Madame Feng insisted on calling him Old Lei. However, as she thought about this, Mo Chenga also had some doubts. These two people seemed to be different from other people. Was there some kind of relationship between them? Just as she was about to send a secret message to Qin, she remembered what happened just now and swallowed her words. If there was some kind of relationship between them, Qin should have told her long ago. Since he didn't say anything, that meant there was no relationship, right? Mo Chenga shook her head, threw this matter to the back of her mind, and continued on their journey in silence. The flying speed of core formation cultivators was originally fast. After several days they were already close to the boundary of Mount Yuheng. There were more and more cultivators flying in the sky. Among them there were many high-level cultivators and occasionally, there were even nascent soul cultivators passing by. This time, the weakening of demonic mountains restrictions could be said to have shocked most of the cultivators in the celestial pole. Cultivators who were stuck in bottlenecks and lacked fated chances rushed over one after another. Even those who cultivated smoothly were also hesitant. After all, the path to immortality was difficult. If they could obtain some fated chances, it might be better than cultivating painstakingly for several hundred years. Even aura refining and foundation building cultivators were restless. They naturally didn't dare to go deep into Demonic Mountain, but they might also find some treasures in the periphery of Demonic Mountain. If they were lucky, they might be able to benefit from it for the rest of their lives, and they might even become high-level cultivators in one go. Tiandao sect was known as the #1 sect in the celestial pole, so there were originally many cultivators gathered around it. At this time it was even more bustling. However, as core formation cultivators, Mo Chinga's group didn't need to wander around Mount Yuheng like ordinary cultivators. They had to look for their own lodgings because Tiandao sect would receive them. Mount Yuheng was closely connected to Demonic Mountain, so if they wanted to go to Demonic Mountain, they had to pass through Mount Yuheng. The entire Mount Yuheng belonged to Tiandao sect, so if they wanted to go to Demonic Mountain, they had to pass through Tiandao sect. Demonic Mountain had enormous wealth, but it also had dangers in the world. Tiandao sect naturally didn't dare to monopolize it, but taking advantage of the opportunity to make money was inevitable. Every cultivator who entered had to pay a fee to borrow the path. This fee wasn't too much, and it wasn't even worth mentioning for core formation cultivators. However, they had a lot of people, so every time Demonic Mountain opened, Tiandao sect would make a huge windfall. In addition, there were also many people peddling maps and notes about Demonic Mountain in the small town at the foot of Mount Yuheng. The prices were very high, but there was an endless stream of people buying them. Mo Chinga originally thought it was interesting and wanted to buy one to take a look, but Qin stopped her. He said, "These things are useless. Most of them are incomplete and only have things on the periphery. The place we're going to is much deeper, so these things aren't involved at all." Mo Chinga thought he was right, so she gave up. With the things Lord Daoist Jinghe brought, why would they still need to buy from these peddlers? Some of these peddlers were even mortals, so it was obvious they wouldn't have anything too good. Under Daoist Kumu's lead, the 7 of them went up Mount Yuheng. Fellow Daoist Kumu, fellow Daoist Tong, fellow Daoist Shoujing. As soon as they arrived at Tiandao sect's gate, a core formation cultivator greeted them with a smile. "Fellow Daoists, you've arrived really early." Mo Chinga looked at him. This was a Tiandao sect cultivator about 30 years old, and his cultivation level was in the middle stage of the core formation realm. Judging from the way he greeted Daoist Kumu and the others, they seemed to be familiar with each other. Everyone returned the greeting. Lei Dongqing was the only one who looked very gloomy since they arrived at Mount Yuheng. Mo Chinga recalled Qin Shi once said Lei Dongqing was originally a cultivator from Tiandao sect. It was only because he offended someone that he was pushed out of the sect. Judging from his expression now, he indeed harbored great resentment towards Tiandao sect. Besides, since he was a Tiandao sect cultivator and had a core formation cultivation level, he must be an elder. How could he not have an immortal's cave on Mount Yuheng? In this situation, this cultivator treated her like an ordinary cultivator, but he didn't mention it as if he had nothing to do with Tiandao sect. "Oh, this is..." The cultivator looked at Mo Chinga and asked in surprise. "Qin," she said, "Fellow Daoist Ji, this is my junior martial sister. Her Daoist name is Qingwei." "Oh, so this is the famous Master Daoist Qingwei. It's an honor to meet you." The core formation cultivator named Ji Feng greeted her with a smile. His tone was full of amazement. "Fellow Daoist Ji, you're too polite." Mo Chinga returned the greeting. Ji Feng didn't seem to be polite. His tone was very enthusiastic. "Fellow Daoist Qingwei's name has spread throughout Kunwu, but I'm not being polite. Shenqing School has produced genius cultivators again and again, it really makes us envious." Mo Chinga smiled, but she just cupped her hands and didn't say much. Seeing that she didn't like to talk much, Ji Feng didn't say much. He said with a smile, "Fellow Taoists came from afar, so you must be tired. Please take a rest first." Although the 7 of them weren't physically tired, they also felt mentally tired after traveling in silence for several days, so none of them objected. Ji Feng handed them over to the 2 aura refining cultivators who were in charge of receiving guests. The 2 aura refining cultivators then led them into the mountain gate. The group of people didn't walk far before they arrived at a huge courtyard. Mo Chinga scanned the courtyard with her divine sense. There were indeed a lot of core formation cultivators in the courtyard. She estimated there were at least 30 to 40 of them. There were about 2 or 3 months left before Demonic Mountain opened, and it was unknown how many people would come later. Once they entered the courtyard, another cultivator immediately came to greet them. "Seniors, you've come from afar. Welcome, welcome." Then he very attentively led them to their respective residences. This courtyard was very large, and each small courtyard had several rooms. 2 small courtyards for the 7 of them were enough. After Chenga settled down in her room, that cultivator didn't retreat. He just stood at the door and watched. For a moment, Chenga didn't understand what they were doing. It was only when she heard other cultivators thanking her for the reward from the room to her left that she understood. She then took out a small bag of spirit stones and threw it over. That cultivator was only in the aura refining realm. When he touched the bag of spirit stones, he felt there were at least 100 spirit stones inside. He was so happy that he repeatedly thanked her. "Thank you, Senior, for your reward. Thank you, Senior." Chenga shook her head as she watched that cultivator retreat. Since he was a core formation cultivator, she naturally had to be a bit more generous. Coupled with the fees for borrowing the Wei Tiandao sect really made a huge profit. Chapter 272. In fact, Chenga missed out on one benefit. After they settled down, Qin once again sent her a summoning talisman, telling her to go to the market square at the foot of the mountain. The 2 of them lived in the same courtyard and were in adjacent rooms, yet they insisted on using summoning talismans to send messages. This made Chenga rather speechless. Even if he didn't knock on the door, he could just use a private message. When she arrived at the market square and saw the bustling crowd and the cultivators going in and out of the shops, Chenga finally remembered that when it came to profits, this was the real deal. With so many cultivators, Tiandao Sect's shop would be able to do a lot of business in the near future. Even the other small shops would benefit from it. Both of them were core formation cultivators. Although high-grade cultivators from the Heavenly Dao sect had been coming and going recently, walking on the street like this still attracted a lot of attention. The low-level cultivators only looked at them from afar with envy and jealousy in their eyes. "Senior brother Shoujing, where are we going?" Although Chenga had slowly gotten used to this scene, she wasn't a genius who had been the center of everyone's attention since the beginning. She was happy and content in this kind of situation, but she felt very uncomfortable. She said, "Deal." Chenga was stunned. "What does Senior Martial Brother want to buy?" She didn't answer. With his hands clasped behind his back, he continued to walk forward. Chenga was already used to his temperament of not answering if he didn't want to, so she didn't say anything and just followed him silently. After a while, the 2 of them entered a shop. Chenga raised her head to take a look. What a coincidence. This shop was the 100 Herbs Hall, the shop she came to buy a concocting furnace and materials the first time she came to Tiandao sect. More than 60 years had passed since then, and the old aura refining man who sold her the concocting furnace had probably passed away a long time ago. Thinking back to that time, things really remained the same, but people had changed. At that time, second uncle hadn't died and she was still just a little aura refining cultivator. No one on Mount Yuheng cared about her at all. Right now, she was already a core formation cultivator. Everyone treated her with respect, but second uncle would never come back. As soon as they entered 100 Herb Hall, a shop assistant immediately came forward and greeted them respectfully. "Welcome, seniors. Is there anything this junior can help you with?" She didn't answer. He only said, "I'm looking for Hu Zonghai." Upon hearing this, a surprised expression appeared on the shop assistant's face, but he immediately said, "Please take a seat inside. This junior will immediately report to you. May I know your name?" "My surname is Qin." The waiter led them to a side room and went to report. Chenga was filled with questions. The old man she met here 60 years ago was a member of the Hu family. Thinking about it, this 100 Herb Hall was most likely managed by the Hu family. If that was the case, then this Hu Zonghai was undoubtedly a member of the Hu family. She clearly said he was looking for Hu Zonghai. Could it be his old friend? This wasn't strange at all. Master had once said that apart from cultivating in seclusion, this senior martial brother also spent a lot of time outside. Presumably, he had gotten to know many strange people with different identities. Not long after, the door to the room was pushed open, and a middle-aged man dressed in luxurious clothes walked in. As soon as he entered, he saw Qin Shi and very enthusiastically greeted him. He laughed and said loudly, "Brother Qin, it's really you. I haven't seen you in years. How are you?" What astonished Mo Tiange was that this person was only in the foundation building realm. Upon seeing this person, Qin Shi stood up to return the greeting. Compared to this person's warm attitude, he was much calmer, but he didn't seem rude. Thank you for your concern, Brother Hu. How have you been? The two of them clearly had different levels of cultivation, but they were peers. After exchanging a few pleasantries, the man's gaze fell on Mo Tiange. This is, Qin Shi said, this is my junior martial sister. Her Taoist name is Qingwei. Oh, so it's Master Taoist Qingwei. The man suddenly realized and very politely saluted. I'm Hu Zonghai. Greetings, Master Taoist Qingwei. Hu Zonghai was only a foundation building cultivator. Under normal circumstances, core formation cultivators didn't need to return the greeting. However, Qin Shi was her senior martial brother after all, and they treated each other as peers, so Mo Tiange couldn't put on airs. She stood up and raised her hand. Greetings, fellow Taoist Hu. I don't dare, Hu Zonghai said repeatedly. Master Taoist Qingwei, please sit, please sit. After the greeting, Hu Zonghai very enthusiastically asked someone to serve them tea again and invited them to Hu clan as guests. Qin Shi declined and Hu Zonghai didn't insist, so the two of them began to chat. In the end, the gap between their cultivation levels was too big. Although Hu Zonghai spoke to Qin Shi as peers, his words were very polite. The topics they talked about were also ordinary, nothing more than some ordinary things, news about the weakening of restrictions on Demonic Mountain this time and some cultivation problems. Mo Tiange just listened in silence. From their conversation she roughly understood their relationship. When she met Hu Zonghai, Qin Shi was only a foundation-building cultivator. They went through trials and tribulations together, so they were now friends of the same generation. Qin Shi was almost 200 years old now. For core formation cultivators he was very young, but for foundation-building cultivators he was middle-aged. In a few decades he would enter old age. Hu Zonghai was actually the same age as him, but because of the gap in their cultivation levels he looked much older than him. The two of them talked for a while. Hu Zonghai asked, Brother Qin, you came to Tiandao sect by asking someone to pass a message. Now that you've come in person, is there something important? The two of them seemed to have a good relationship, but they weren't close friends. Qin Shi came to visit them as soon as he came, and he even brought someone else with him. Obviously he had another purpose. Qin Shi smiled and said bluntly, Brother Hu is right. I came to visit you today because I need your help. Hu Zonghai's expression was sincere. He smiled and said, Based on our many years of friendship, Brother Qin, if you have something to say, just say it. As long as I can do it, I definitely won't refuse. Mo Tiange couldn't tell whether this was polite or not. This Hu Zonghai was obviously different from cultivators like them. His words were forthright, but he was also slippery and experienced. He must be someone who was very good at dealing with people. Qin Shi only had a slight smile on his face. He said, It's not a big deal. I just want to ask Brother Hu about two spiritual objects. Mo Tiange's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't help but look at Qin Shi. Hu Zonghai was surprised. Brother Qin, are you looking for some kind of natural treasure? Even with Xianxing School's connections you still couldn't find it? Qin Shi smiled. Since I can't find it, it must be something extremely difficult to find. Hu Zonghai laughed. You're right. Brother Qin, tell me about it. Although my cultivation level isn't high enough, I'm good at finding people and things. Maybe I've heard of it. Qin Shi said bluntly, I'm looking for two things. One is 1,000-year-old chalcedony, and the other is Qiyun stone. Brother Hu, have you heard of them recently? Mo Tiange lowered her head. Sure enough, he was looking for those two things. About that. Hu Zonghai pondered for a while. Brother Qin is indeed looking for rare things. 1,000-year-old chalcedony is fine since I've heard of it occasionally, but Qiyun stone, if I didn't manage the shop for the sect all year round, I'm afraid I wouldn't know what it is. However, I manage 100 Herbs Hall, and Qiyun stone is a material for refining tools, so I have to ask around. Qin Shi said, If Brother Hu can tell me where it is, I'll be very grateful. Hu Zonghai smiled. It's nothing. It's nothing. Brother Qin, I can't guarantee anything about Qiyun stone, but there seems to be news about 1,000-year-old chalcedony a few days ago. If you don't mind, can you wait for me to inquire about it? That'll be great. Thank you, Brother Hu. The two of them chatted for a while before Qin Shi took his leave. Hu Zonghai saw the two of them out, asked where they were staying, and told them that he would inform them if he had any news in 3 days at most. After saying goodbye to Hu Zonghai, the two of them went back in silence. Qin she didn't say anything and Emo Chenga also lowered her head, her mind wandering. The monastery of a big cultivation group was naturally very high. From the foot of the mountain, there were thousands of jade steps that extended all the way to the clouds. Under normal circumstances, only aura-refining disciples who couldn't fly would climb these jade steps. After they built their foundation they could only fly. Emo Chenga didn't know what Qin she was thinking. He didn't use a flying magic weapon and just walked step by step. However, Emo Chenga was preoccupied, so she just followed him with her head lowered and didn't think about this. As they walked, the person in front of them suddenly stopped. Emo Chenga bumped into him, causing her nose to turn red. If it weren't for the spiritual aura protecting her body, she might have had a nosebleed. Qin she turned around and stared at her with a frown. What are you thinking about? Why did you bump into him like this? Emo Chenga looked embarrassed. Not to mention a core formation cultivator like her, even a small aura-refining cultivator who had just entered the path of immortality wouldn't stupidly bump into someone else's back. It was clear that she was completely distracted just now. She clearly bumped into him but she didn't react in time. Fortunately, Qin she didn't ask her about it seriously. After saying that, he continued walking. Emo Chenga touched her nose and continued to follow him. Staring at the back of the person in front of her, she suddenly felt like she had returned to the time when she was in Yunwu sect. At that time she didn't spend much time with senior martial brother Qin, but every time they met, it was more or less the same. He would spontaneously walk in front of her and she would just follow him. In the blink of an eye, more than 60 years had passed. The two of them were no longer the small cultivators from back then. Their statuses were as different as heaven and earth, but the situation they got along with each other was still the same. At that time they each had their own secrets. When they entered Yunwu sect, they called each other senior martial brother and junior martial brother but kept a distance from each other. Now they were real martial brothers and sisters but they still kept their distance. Although they trusted each other, they didn't open their hearts to each other. In fact, whether it was senior martial brother Qin or senior martial brother Shoujing, both of them treated her extremely well. Senior martial brother Qin was cold, but he always cared about their relationship as fellow disciples. As for senior martial brother Shoujing, he seemed indifferent, but if she thought about it carefully, her smooth journey might have been because he paved the way in front of her. Just like now. She only mentioned it once, but he always remembered that the first thing he had to do after arriving at Tiandao sect was to inquire about information for her. It would be a lie to say she didn't feel grateful, but she had never been an outgoing person. Even if she felt grateful, she would only keep it in her heart. Senior martial brother Shoujing. She suddenly stopped. Qin she seemed to answer her carelessly. He took several steps forward, but when he realized she wasn't following him, he stopped and turned around. He saw her standing about 5 or 6 steps away from him. Her head was lowered, so he couldn't see her expression clearly. After a while she finally said, "Thank you." It was a sentence without any head or tail, but he understood it. After a moment of silence, he said with an indifferent expression, "It was nothing. No need to mention it again." Her head was still lowered but she didn't answer. He also didn't say anything. After a long time Emo Chenga finally said, "But, senior martial brother, please don't treat me so well in the future." Qin she suddenly turned around and walked up 2 steps. He then stopped and said coldly, "What are you worried about?" Emo Chenga didn't say anything. He turned his head, glanced at her and sneered. "Or do you think I'm greedy for something?" Without waiting for her answer, he waved his long sleeve and summoned his flying cloud. In a flash he flew up the jade steps and went straight to Mount Yuheng. He didn't wait for her even for a moment. Emo Chenga was left behind. She stared at his back and swallowed back the words, "No." She just wanted to say that he shouldn't treat her so well. If he treated her so well that she would overthink things, it wasn't what he thought. Chapter 273. 3 days later, as expected, Hu Zhonghai sent a message. But at that time, Emo Chenga was cultivating, so he left after seeing Qin Shi. After Hu Zhonghai left, Qin Shi sent her a summoning talisman saying there was no hope on this side. The last time the Qiyun stone appeared on Mount Yuheng was several hundred years ago. Its whereabouts were unknown, so it had probably been used long ago. The 1,000-year-old chalcedony did appear several years ago, but unfortunately when Hu Zhonghai found the person who bought it, that person stubbornly refused to sell it no matter what conditions Hu Zhonghai proposed. Although Hu Zhonghai was only a foundation-building cultivator, he was a member of the number 1 cultivation clan in Tiandao sect. This was Tiandao sect, but that person was unwilling to give him face. Even if Qin Shi went there himself, he probably wouldn't have a chance. Mo Chenga was a bit disappointed when she heard this, but she soon cheered up. Even if she couldn't get it here, there was still hope in Kuanzhong City. Since this heavenly aromatic bean wasn't rare, even if she couldn't get it, someone else would. When she left Demonic Mountain, she could exchange or buy it with that person. No one could say for sure how long it would take for the restrictions on Demonic Mountain to disappear. But according to previous experience, the earliest would be 2 months, and the latest might be more than half a year. After about a month, the restrictions would slowly become stronger until they couldn't enter or leave. In order to enter Demonic Mountain, as soon as the restrictions disappeared, more and more people came to Mount Yuheng. Fortunately, core formation cultivators were very proud, so they couldn't be bothered. As time passed, the restrictions on Demonic Mountain became weaker and weaker. These core formation cultivators finally couldn't sit still anymore. Every day, more and more people went out to inquire about the situation, and the originally quiet courtyard became more and more noisy. In the end, Mo Chenga stopped cultivating and only meditated for a while every day. She was either concocting pills or refining magic weapons to increase her strength when she entered Demonic Mountain. One day, 2 months later, they suddenly received news that the restrictions on Demonic Mountain would disappear the day after tomorrow. This news immediately spread throughout Mount Yuheng. All the cultivators rushed to the back of Mount Yuheng, scrambling to occupy a good position so they could enter Demonic Mountain as soon as possible. Their team also began to move. Core formation cultivators always received preferential treatment. Unlike foundation building and aura refining cultivators, they didn't have to accept Tiandao sect's control. Instead, they had someone to lead the way. Very soon, they arrived at the border between Mount Yuheng and Demonic Mountain. The flattest place leading to Demonic Mountain was a valley. Knowing that Mo Chenga had never been here before, Taoist Kumu explained the place to her in detail. The restrictions here would be at their weakest, so it was the safest entrance. Mo Chenga had already read about these things in the jade slips Lord Taoist Jinghe gave her. However, Taoist Kumu had personal experience, so she might be able to gain something else from listening to him talk about it. Looking up, the small valley was now densely packed with cultivators. Core formation cultivators like them naturally occupied the best spots. Mo Chenga swept her gaze around. There were at least 100 core formation cultivators both near and far. There were still more than 1,000 core formation cultivators in the Celestial Pole, so there weren't too many of them. The foundation building cultivators and aura refining cultivators rested about 1,000 feet away from the core formation cultivators. Judging by the number of people, there were at least 10 times their number. Seeing that her gaze fell on these low-level cultivators, Tong Tianyun shook his head and sighed. I wonder how many of these people will survive. Alas. Mo Chenga's gaze flickered. Demonic Mountain was a dangerous place. Even core formation cultivators like them couldn't protect themselves, let alone those foundation building and aura refining cultivators. Every time Demonic Mountain opened, countless cultivators would pour in, but less than half of them could survive. Most of those who died were low-level cultivators. Mo Chenga looked around but didn't see any nascent soul cultivators. She also couldn't sense any with her divine sense. Mo Chenga couldn't help but whisper to Qin Shi, Senior Martial Brother, why aren't there any nascent soul cultivators? Where's Master? Has he arrived yet? Qin Shi was meditating with his eyes closed. He didn't open his eyes when he heard what she said. After a while, he also whispered to her, Master arrived a long time ago. We don't care about nascent soul cultivators. We just need to wait patiently. Mo Chenga thought he was right. Master was usually unreliable, but he was never careless when it came to proper business. Presumably he was waiting somewhere else. Time passed bit by bit. In the beginning, with so many people gathered, they could still hear the continuous chatter. In the end, everyone could feel the restriction weakening. Their gazes were fixed on the other side of the valley where it connected to Demonic Mountain, but the valley with thousands of people was completely silent. The golden crow and the jade rabbit rose and fell again. A day passed. On the afternoon of the second day, they finally saw the light curtain-like restriction on the other side of the valley slowly dim until it disappeared. Once again, a buzzing sound rang out in the valley. Then the crowd began to flock together. It was extremely chaotic. Fortunately, the core formation cultivators were at the forefront. They naturally wouldn't lose control like these low-level cultivators. At this time, the first person to enter the valley wasn't a core formation cultivator. Instead, several flight lights suddenly appeared in the sky, carrying incomparable momentum. Mo Chinga's heart trembled. Such momentum. They must be nascent soul cultivators without a doubt. Sure enough, these cultivators soon landed at the place where the restriction disappeared. They were indeed several nascent soul cultivators. These nascent soul cultivators didn't say anything. They each stepped forward, slowly entered the restriction, and their figures soon disappeared. The core formation cultivators still didn't move because these nascent soul cultivators were flying into Demonic Mountain one after another. Mo Chinga finally saw Lord Daoist Jingha's figure. Lord Daoist Jingha, a male cultivator wrapped in black from head to toe, a bald cultivator, and Lord Daoist Huayan didn't look at them and also entered. There weren't many nascent soul cultivators who entered Demonic Mountain this time. Mo Chinga counted about 20 people. However, there were only about 100 core formation cultivators. Compared to them, nascent soul cultivators were considered a lot. This wasn't strange. In the current cultivation world, deification was only a legend. None of the great late-stage nascent soul cultivators in the Celestial Pole had ever seen a deification cultivator. Most of these nascent soul cultivators were stuck in the early stage and couldn't make any progress. Except for those who had a long lifespan and were unwilling to give up, most of them had given up on advancing to the next realm. Because of this, as soon as Demonic Mountain appeared, those nascent soul cultivators who didn't have much lifespan left or were trapped in a realm with no hope of advancing didn't want to give up this opportunity. In any case, the possibility of them advancing to the next realm was very small, and they'd cultivated to the peak of the current cultivation world, so why wouldn't they take the risk? However, core formation cultivators rarely thought this way. They were already high-level cultivators and most of them had high statuses. Those who had hopes of advancing to the nascent soul realm wouldn't rashly enter Demonic Mountain. Mo Chinga and Qin Shi were only anomalies. Among the more than 100 core formation cultivators in front of them, only a few of them could be found. When all the nascent soul cultivators entered Demonic Mountain, some core formation cultivators finally couldn't hold back and took the lead to enter. Mo Chinga's small team squeezed into the crowd and entered Demonic Mountain at a time neither too early nor too late. As soon as they passed the place where the restriction originally existed, Mo Chinga felt her vision blurred and the scene in front of her was already very different. There were no jagged rocks like she imagined, and there was also no dusky fog like she imagined. Instead, there was a field of green. It was as if they were still on Mount Yuheng, surrounded by immortal aura and pressing spiritual aura. Mo Chinga looked back and found that the place where the two mountains met was a bit strange. When they were in the valley, the restriction disappeared, and they saw Demonic Mountain was also dusky, so she mistakenly thought Demonic Mountain should be dark. Now that they were on Demonic Mountain looking at the entrance to Mount Yuheng, there was obviously nothing blocking their line of sight, but they couldn't see the scene outside. They could only see people continuously appearing at the entrance as if it was a transporting formation. Fellow Taoists. Among them, the others were somewhat indifferent, so the role of the leader had always been played by Taoist Kumu. Now that they entered Demonic Mountain, it was also Taoist Kumu who took the lead to say, "We've already discussed the route. Let's go according to the original plan, okay?" Everyone nodded without any objections. Before entering Demonic Mountain, they had 2 months to gather information and discuss a plan. Mo Chinga originally didn't know much about this, so she didn't intervene. In any case, Qin Shi was trustworthy. He didn't say no, so presumably there wouldn't be any problems. The place they wanted to go wasn't very dangerous. After all, among them, except for Taoist Kumu and Tong Tianyun, the others still had several hundred years left in their lifespans, so they really didn't need to take any big risks. However, they also had an agreement. During the 1-month period when the restriction disappeared, they had half a month to move around freely. If they wanted to go to a place that was too dangerous, the others could only follow them if they wanted. Those who didn't want to follow them would wait at the original place. If they didn't go back when the time was up, they could only pray for their own luck. Unlike foundation building and aura refining cultivators, most core formation cultivators didn't like to move in groups. They had a lot of experience and were much more selfish by nature. They often calculated risks and benefits very clearly, and they rarely sacrificed anything for others, even if it was their companions. Mo Chinga naturally didn't have any objections. Her purpose in entering the valley was different from others. Others wanted natural treasures, but she wanted corpses. Qin Shi knew where her father's corpse was. Recently, she occasionally heard Qin Shi mention that he once found some kind of unusual treasure in that dangerous place, but it wasn't convenient for him to retrieve it. This time he came to Demonic Mountain with the intention of retrieving that unusual treasure. In that case, the two of them had to leave the group. After all, Qin wouldn't tell them about the unusual treasure, and the others also had other goals and wouldn't take risks with them. The group of 7 people followed Taoist Kumu's instructions and slowly walked forward. In the beginning, the scenery of Demonic Mountain wasn't much different from Mount Yuheng, but gradually the verdant color faded a lot. It became more and more desolate and dusky. There were barriers and restrictions everywhere in the air. The spiritual aura turbulence was fierce and gales blew from time to time. If one was unlucky and ran into one or two of them, one could easily be decapitated. They hadn't gone far when they heard several screams. Emo Chenga turned around to look at them. She realized they were foundation building and aura refining cultivators. Many of them had never entered Demonic Mountain before. They only heard about the rumors and bought 1 or 2 maps and information about Demonic Mountain at the foot of Mount Yuheng. Then, relying on a burst of motivation, they entered Demonic Mountain. These people didn't have enough strength, experience, or vigilance. As soon as they entered Demonic Mountain, they would easily run into those floating restrictions and die instantly. What made Mo Chenga feel between laughter and tears was that there was actually a little girl among them. Her companions were blown away by the gales, but she was so scared that she actually cried and shouted that she wanted to go back, making the others frown. No matter what happened outside, once you entered Demonic Mountain, you couldn't control your own life. Even if you died instantly, no one would sympathize with you. Chapter 274. There was no sun in the sky, there was only a hazy white light. Taoist Kumu said that on Demonic Mountain, spiritual aura and devil aura covered the sky, so sunlight couldn't shine in. This light was actually the light formed by the intertwining of spiritual aura and devil aura. Therefore there was no day or night on Demonic Mountain. It was always like this and time couldn't be distinguished. In the air, the gales became fiercer, and the remaining restrictions became stronger. There were many corpses on the ground. Most of their clothes were torn but some were still intact. Upon closer inspection, the intact clothes were all spirit tools or magic tools. These corpses had no flesh and only dry bones were left. The color of the bones was very white and even a little transparent, so they hadn't been dead for a long time. Maybe they were the cultivators who died here the last time Demonic Mountain opened. They didn't have Chinquan bags with them. Things like Chinquan bags wouldn't rot even after thousands of years, so they must have been taken away by others. Taoist Kumu stopped, looked around and asked Tong Tianyun, "Was this the place we came last time?" Mo Chenga looked around. There were rocks everywhere and some weeds grew in the middle. She really couldn't see any difference from the scene just now. Tong Tianyun was probably the same. After looking for a while he said, "I can't tell." Everyone took out their maps and looked for the location according to the map. Taoist Kumu said that gales would blow from time to time on Demonic Mountain, so leaving a mark was useless. They could only slowly find the location based on memory. Mo Chenga looked around. Qin Shi's expression was very gloomy, and he was frowning while looking into the distance. She felt a little uncertain. Although Qin Shi might not answer, she still asked in a low voice, "Senior Marshal Brother Shoujing, what's wrong?" Qin Shi didn't answer for a long time. After a long time, he looked away from the distance and said faintly, "This time, I'm afraid the restrictions on Demonic Mountain are unstable." Mo Chenga was stunned and looked at the place he was looking at. Qin Shi continued to say, "Look at the sky. If the spiritual aura and devil aura reached a balance, there wouldn't be lightning all the time." She looked into the distance. At the end of her line of sight, there was an extremely bright white light that flashed from time to time, looking like lightning. They didn't use secret messages, so the others all heard them. Kumu and Tong Tianyun also raised their heads and looked over, their faces turning more and more serious. After watching for a while, Taoist Kumu exhaled and said, "Fellow Taoist Shoujing is right. Last time we were already in a very dangerous situation. This time it doesn't look like it's going to be easy. If a big restriction is unstable and collapses, we may all be buried inside." He spoke so seriously that no one else had a smile on their faces. Even Jing Xingji put away his frivolity and said, "Can it be more dangerous than last time?" Tong Tianyun smiled. "We managed to retreat in time last time, but what about this time? It's very difficult for us to encounter the disappearance of Demonic Mountain's restrictions again. Presumably you won't give up this opportunity, right?" Jing Xingji didn't speak. His face was gloomy as he raised his head to look at the lightning on the distant horizon. Then his gaze circled around them. His first glance was obviously to assess their strength, so the first person he eliminated was Mo Chenga. Then his gaze lightly swept over Madame Feng and Lei Dongqing before finally stopping on Qin Shi, Taoist Kumu, and Tong Tianyun. The first person he looked at was Qin Shi, but when his gaze fell on Mo Chenga next to him, he let out an almost inaudible sigh. Then he looked at the two Taoists, but in the end he shook his head as if he had given up. Jing Xingji withdrew his gaze and shifted his line of sight to Mo Chenga, who was staring at him intently. At first, a hint of surprise flashed across his face, but soon he smiled and winked at her with his peach blossom eyes. Mo Chenga ignored his flirtatious gesture and withdrew her gaze. Their group of 7 was very interesting. Jing Xingji's slight gesture just now was obviously to look for collaborators, but unfortunately he got nothing in the end. Mo Chenga wasn't strong enough, and Madame Feng and Lei Dongqing might not be suitable because of their incompatible personalities. As for Qin Shi bringing Mo Chenga, he also eliminated them. But she was very surprised that Jing Xingji eliminated Taoist Kumu and Tong Tianyun. Taking everything into account, Taoist Kumu and Tong Tianyun had both strength and experience, so they should be the most suitable candidates. Why did Jing Xingji end up like that? Although her experience in dealing with matters couldn't compare to Taoist Kumu and the others, Mo Chenga had been speculating about people's minds since she was a child, and she had also seen a lot of people. Even if her conjecture wasn't completely correct, it shouldn't be too far off. Besides, although Jing Xingji was a bit scheming, he wasn't to the point where he couldn't see through anything. Not to mention Jing Xingji, Madame Feng and Lei Dongqing became silent after they entered Demonic Mountain. Although they didn't spend much time together, Mo Chenga also felt something was a bit unusual. Could it be that their previous experience was too terrifying? That wasn't impossible. Based on what Qin Shi said, it was fortunate that they retreated early last time. Otherwise they would have also been buried on Demonic Mountain. Since the matter was very important, it was natural for them to look serious. The last 2 people were Taoist Kumu and Tong Tianyun. These 2 people were very strange. According to Qin Shi, they might have been exchanging 10,000-year-old spiritual plants with some nascent soul cultivator, and the timing was right before Demonic Mountain. Based on that, it was very likely they were preparing for this trip. Of course, this was just their guess. Mo Chenga also didn't dare to confirm the possibility. The only thing she could be sure of was that these 5 people weren't simple. When they met up with these people in Kuanzhong City, Qin Shi once said that these people's characters were generally trustworthy, but their characters were a bit strange. Apart from their characters were generally trustworthy. In other words, without the inducement of great benefits, these people were trustworthy companions. But if there were great benefits, it was also very possible for them to turn hostile. Thinking up to this point, she cautiously looked at everyone, carefully sizing up their expressions and movements. During this period of time, they had already discussed their next move. No matter where they were going in the end, they had to go to the mountainside of Demonic Mountain in the end. Core formation and nascent soul cultivators had to go above the mountainside to look for treasures. They had already discussed the route and so on. Now that it was settled, the 7 people set off again. Demonic Mountain was extremely high, and the sky was full of restrictions and spiritual aura traps. In such an environment, flying was obviously impractical, so no matter what cultivation level cultivators were at, they had to move forward cautiously. Demonic Mountain was ridiculously huge, and the scenery was of no value as a reference. Before long they couldn't see other people around them. They could only vaguely feel the spiritual aura fluctuations of other cultivators at the edge of their divine senses. "Wait," Tong Tianyun suddenly said. The group stopped and looked at him. He closed his eyes as if he was spreading his divine sense. Upon seeing this, Mo Chenga also focused her attention and frowned. Qin Shi saw the change in her expression and asked in a low voice, "What's wrong?" Mo Chenga didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at Tong Tianyun, who had already opened his eyes. Tong Tianyun said, "There's a very strong spiritual aura fluctuation nearby. I don't know if it's because of the birth of a unique treasure or because the restrictions were broken." Spiritual aura was the foundation of cultivation and fights of magical powers for cultivators. Whether it was restrictions or unique treasures, they couldn't be separated from spiritual aura. Restrictions were extremely dangerous, and unique treasures were their biggest goals in entering Demonic Mountain. One was heaven and the other was earth. It all depended on their choice. In an instant, everyone made a choice and no one flinched. Since they entered Demonic Mountain, this was the biggest fated chance they were looking for, so how could they be unwilling to take risks? Tong Tianyun wasn't surprised. He identified the direction and said, "This way." This time they weren't just walking, they were flying close to the ground. When encountering this kind of situation, it was naturally a competition to see who was faster. If they walked slowly and let others take the lead, it wouldn't be worth it. Once they entered Demonic Mountain, Mo Chenga no longer hid her strength. She held the white silk handkerchief in her hand and flew in the air. Her cloud-treading boots weren't slower than them at all, which made Taoist Kumu look at her in surprise. Senior Martial Brother Shoujing. Mo Chenga's whisper entered Qinshi's ears, so he also whispered back, "What's wrong? Did you find something?" Mo Chenga was a bit uncertain. She said, "The spiritual aura over there is very unstable. It seems like there are many strands." Qinshi was stunned. He took another look at her and nodded softly. "I see. Pay more attention." Although Tong Qianyun's divine sense was the most powerful among them, Qinshi was a peak stage core formation cultivator after all, so he wasn't much weaker than Tong Tianyun. He also sensed the spiritual aura just now, but he didn't sense it as clearly as Mo Chenga did. This was no longer a matter of the strength of the divine sense, but a matter of the subtle control of the divine sense. The soul-refining art was indeed powerful. Although the early stage of the core formation realm and the peak stage of the core formation realm were both in the core formation realm, there was a huge difference in their strengths. However, Mo Chenga had just formed her gold core, yet her divine sense was even better than his in the subtle aspects. The group of people moved forward at an extremely fast speed. All of a sudden they heard a soft chi sound, followed by Madame Feng's cry. The 6 people stopped and looked at her. Madame Feng covered her arm, which was already dripping with blood. She said with a pale face, "We hit a drifting restriction." The others understood. There were big restrictions and small ones. The big ones were like lightning on the horizon, while the small ones were like specks of dust and were very difficult to see. However, these kinds of drifting, small restrictions were very rare. Madame Feng was really unlucky. Fortunately, she only suffered a minor injury. Lei Dongqing took out a jade bottle from his robe and threw it to her. "Bear with it for a while. We don't have much time. We have to hurry." Madame Feng nodded, opened the jade bottle, and applied the powdery substance on her wound. She then threw the jade bottle back to Lei Dongqing, took out a medicinal pill, swallowed it, and straightened her clothes. "Let's go." Since it was an adventure, there was no difference between men and women. The others also didn't have the heart to be protective of the fairer sex, so they immediately hurried on their way. They soon covered the distance of several hundred miles. When they saw what was lying on the ground, astonishment flashed across their eyes. It was actually a boat. It wasn't the small flying boat Tong Tianyun had, but an extremely gorgeous decorated pleasure boat with carved railings and painted rafters. This decorated pleasure boat was already very dilapidated and had lost its bright luster, but it was still in good condition. The turbulent spiritual aura came from inside the boat. The 7 people stopped in front of the boat. None of them went forward. They all knew what kind of place Demonic Mountain was. This was a battlefield, so how could there be a boat here? After watching for a while, Taoist Kumu said with a frown, "Fellow Taoists, can you see what this is?" Chapter 275. "This is a ship." Lei Dongqing blurted out a silly sentence. Madame Feng rolled her eyes at him and said, "Do I need you to tell me that?" Lei Dongqing probably also felt stupid, so he touched his bald head and didn't refute. She stared at it for a while and suddenly said, "This is a magic weapon?" She took a closer look. This gaily painted pleasure boat was made of special materials and was full of spiritual aura. Wasn't it a magic weapon? But the materials used to make such a big magic weapon were very rare. How many spirit stones would it cost? "It's worthy of being a magic weapon of ancient cultivators," Jing Xingji murmured. This was exactly what everyone else was thinking. Taoist Kumu said, "This magic weapon. How can we take it?" Qinshi shook his head. "We can't." Everyone's gaze fell on him. Such a powerful magic weapon must be very powerful. Anyone who saw it would inevitably be greedy, but he actually said he couldn't take it? Qinshi's eyes were calm. He glanced at them and said expressionlessly, "Think about it. How much effort would it take to take such a magic weapon? It would be enough time for nascent soul cultivators to find this place." They all looked pensive. Madame Feng said, "Qin Shoujing, are you telling us to give up?" "We have to." "Qin," she said resolutely, "let's not talk about whether we can get it or not. Even if we get it, it won't attract the attention of nascent soul cultivators. What about the core formation cultivators nearby? Can you avoid them completely? Don't forget our real purpose. It's not worthwhile to waste too much time here." Madame Fong looked at it and said reluctantly, "Our ultimate goal is nothing more than to get some benefits, whether it's spiritual objects or spiritual treasures. If we can get this magic weapon, why do we need to take risks?" Qin shook his head. "Suit yourself. I won't take it anyway. If you want it, I won't interfere." Taoist Kumu and the others looked hesitant. They all knew this magic weapon was really amazing, and it was very likely that there were other treasures inside, but what Qin said was reasonable. They had known Qin for a long time and knew he meant what he said. If he said he didn't want it now, he really didn't want it. But to put down this magic treasure, it was really, upon seeing their expressions, Qin said faintly, "Since that's the case, Junior Marshal Sister and I will take our leave first. We'll wait for you at Crouching Cloud Ridge. You can come back after you've finished your business." Once he finished speaking, he glanced at Mo Chenga, then turned into a flight light and flew close to the ground. Without any hesitation, Mo Chenga followed closely behind him. Once he left, the others hesitated. After a long while, Lei Dongqing asked, "Fellow Taoist Kumu, what do you think?" After pondering for a while, Taoist Kumu finally made up his mind. "It wasn't easy for us to come here, so let's give it a try. If it doesn't work, then we'll retreat." Tong Tianyun nodded. "That's right. This magic treasure is too amazing. If we let it go, we would have come here for nothing. Besides, Qin Shojing has always been cautious and he doesn't lack magic weapons. We're different." Qin only slowed down after flying for dozens of miles. After a moment of hesitation, Mo Chenga followed him and walked side by side. "Senior Marshal Brother Shojing, you really don't want that magic treasure?" Qin shook his head. "That thing is too big. Let's not talk about how to get it back. It's just a magic treasure after all. Even if we get it, how can we divide it?" Mo Chenga was stunned. "It's not impossible. I feel a lot of spiritual aura, so it's very likely that there are several kinds of magic treasures on the boat. Even so, we don't need to take risks," Qin said. "There are restrictions around that magic treasure, and they can't be broken in a short time. If we stay here for too long, there will definitely be conflicts. The place we're going to is very dangerous, so it's important to preserve our strength." Mo Chenga thought about it and felt what he said seemed reasonable, so she didn't say anything else. And, as they spoke, the two of them had already flown hundreds of miles away. There was no flat ground, only a slope. Qin stopped and put away the flying cloud. He pondered for a moment, then raised his left hand. A dazzling golden light flashed on his arm, and the three young real fire appeared in his hand. He didn't hold it. Instead, he waved his hand and the sword turned into a red light, scattering in front of the two of them. Although she had long guessed his identity, she rarely saw him use magic. The only time she saw him was when he fought with Jing Xingji, and he stopped as soon as the fight started. Qin current technique wasn't strange, but she could see that his magic power was very pure. It was more difficult to transform things into aura than to transform them into objects. Mo Chenga didn't know to what extent he had refined his natal magic treasure to be able to use it as if it were his own arm. Mo Chenga secretly memorized the technique he used. These were all areas she needed to learn. With the spiritual aura transformed from the three young real fire sword around them, their journey forward was much safer. At least they wouldn't be hurt by the tiny restrictions like Madame Fong. Mo Chenga suddenly felt something was wrong and asked, "Senior Marshal Brother, why haven't we seen any demonic beasts?" Qin paused for a moment, then said, "Demonic Mountains terrain is strange, so there aren't many demonic beasts that can survive there. You should pray you don't run into any. If you do, it'll probably be a bitter battle." So that's how it is. As they walked past a gentle slope, the gales suddenly became fierce. Ordinary foundation building cultivators couldn't come up here. The two of them strengthened their protective spiritual auras before they continued forward. Suddenly, Qin's eyes flashed, and he looked around vigilantly. After getting along with him for a while, Mo Chenga was very confident in his sense of danger. Upon seeing his expression, she immediately released the white silk handkerchief, making it float around her and holding several magic weapons in her hands. "You're right." Qin pursed his lips. "There are demonic beasts around." Mo Chenga wasn't too surprised. She used her divine sense to observe her surroundings. Sure enough, she found faint spiritual aura fluctuations approaching. Demonic beasts that could survive in such gales were obviously no small matter. Mo Chenga didn't dare to be careless and looked around vigilantly. The spiritual aura fluctuations became stronger. Qin raised his arm and the red light converged, condensing into the three young real fire sword again floating around him. Then he brandished the sword aura. Woo woo. A beast's roar came from the wind. Sensing the approaching spiritual aura fluctuations, Mo Chenga turned around and was shocked. This demonic beast had 4 feet on the ground, and its whole body was gray. Its eyes were like a wolf's, but it also had a leopard's body. Its teeth were shining with white light, and its claws were sharp. What was especially surprising was that it had a pair of tiny wings on its back. They were so tiny that she felt it couldn't fly at all. This is a Fengxing beast. She stood in front of her. The 3 young real fire sword had flown back, and there was a Fengxing beast's corpse lying not far away. Mo Chenga turned around and stood guard behind him. It wouldn't be scary if there was only one Fengxing beast, but they were now surrounded by a group of Fengxing beasts. The highest cultivation level of these Fengxing beasts was in the 6th rank, while the lowest was only in the 3rd or 4th rank. There were more than a dozen of them and they were completely surrounded. In a fight they probably wouldn't have time to defend themselves. With that thought in mind, Mo Chenga waved the white silk handkerchief, which turned into a cloud of mist and firmly protected her body. Use metal and fire magic weapons. She said. The 3 young real fire sword attacked again, splashing a red light and attacking the Fengxing beasts in front of them. Mo Chenga raised her hand, and a flying sword magic weapon appeared in her hand. She didn't have many magic weapons, but this flying sword was a metal attack magic weapon. Although it wasn't her forte, it was the most suitable magic weapon for now. At the same time she untied her spiritual beast bag and Xiaohua jumped out. Xiaohua had advanced to the 5th rank and possessed Sun Real Fire, so he was already a qualified fighting spiritual beast. Moreover, he was telepathically connected with Mo Chenga, so he pounced on the Fengxing beast next to her without any command. These Fengxing beasts were indeed using wind magic. They opened their mouths and spat out a strong gust of wind. This wind was stronger than gales and it was extremely fast. Mo Chenga had just seen the Fengxing beast open its mouth, but the wind had already arrived in front of her. Relying on the protection of the white silk handkerchief, she didn't dodge. Instead, she released her flying sword and slashed it, cooperating with Xiaohua to kill the same demonic beast. Then she felt her vision blurred. This Fengxing beast's wind magic was unexpectedly so powerful. She glanced at her but didn't say anything. It was unrealistic for her to dodge. The advantage of the Fengxing beasts was their speed. If she dodged, she wouldn't have any room to fight back and would be running around in circles. It was better to fight back. After fighting them several times, Mo Chenga gradually adapted to the rhythm of the Fengxing beast spells and knew how to reduce the force of their wind magic. In addition, Xiaohua's Sun Real Fire was really powerful. Soon all the Fengxing beasts under the 5th rank were killed by her one by one. Most of the Fengxing beasts in front of Qin were already dead or injured. Now that he had attracted the attention of the 2 6th rank Fengxing beasts, Mo Chenga's pressure was instantly reduced. Right now she only had to deal with 2 5th rank Fengxing beasts. She swallowed a medicinal pill and sent her flying sword to stab one of the Fengxing beasts. Upon seeing this, Xiaohua also bit it. The other Fengxing beast took this opportunity to pounce on her. Mo Chenga didn't move. She put her palms together, gathered spiritual aura in them and pushed them forward. This spiritual aura had already solidified. After advancing to the core formation realm, the power of spiritual aura alone was already amazing. However, this spiritual aura could only barely block this Fengxing beast's attack. Mo Chenga frowned. When she was in the foundation building realm, she already faced 5th rank demonic beasts. After she advanced to the core formation realm, ordinary 5th rank demonic beasts were no match for her, but killing these Fengxing beasts was so difficult. Sure enough, on Demonic Mountain, ordinary demonic beasts were also not ordinary. Fortunately, she had Xiaohua. Xiaohua was also in the 5th rank, and its fire magic was extremely destructive. Even so, it still took a lot of effort to kill these 2 5th rank Fengxing beasts. Seeing that the last Fengxing beast fell to Xiaohua's Sun Real Fire, Mo Chenga heaved a sigh of relief, put away her sword and wiped the sweat on her forehead. This was just a warm-up fight, but she already spent so much effort. It wasn't a lie to say that Demonic Mountain was a dangerous place. She had already killed the 2 6th rank Fengxing beasts. Seeing that she had recovered, he said, "Continue." He seemed to be completely emotionless, but Mo Chenga didn't feel anything. This fight made her realize that she had to be strong in this place. Otherwise, she'd become a burden, and this was something she was most unwilling to do. Therefore she didn't say anything. She put Xiaohua back into her spiritual beast bag and followed him. Chapter 276. Qin Shi was familiar with the terrain, so he arrived at his destination in half a day. This is Crouching Cloud Ridge. Let's wait for a while. Mo Chinga glanced at the scenery in front of her. She was surrounded by large and small stones and almost no grass grew. However, there was a dense red leaf forest in the west. From a distance it looked like a sunset. No wonder it was called Crouching Cloud Ridge. Qin Shi found a place to sit down and silently looked at the three young real fire sword on his knees. No one knew what he was thinking. Mo Chinga found a flat stone not far from him and sat down. She looked at the red leaf forest and asked, "Senior Marshal Brother Shojing, is there any danger in that forest?" Qin Shi looked up and said, "It's a kind of flying insect called red leaf ant. It's extremely poisonous. When they gather together, they're like trees. People who don't know what's going on can easily fall into their trap." "I see. In that case, Madame Feng must be in their group to deal with these red leaf ants." Seeing Qin Shi put away the three young real fire sword and meditated with his eyes closed, Mo Chinga also sat cross-legged to adjust her breath. After killing the Fengxing beast and collecting its carcass, Mo Chinga was already tired. Now that she had used up most of her spiritual aura, she could take this opportunity to recover her spiritual aura. They waited for another half a day. Just as Mo Chinga finished recovering her spiritual aura, Qin Shi suddenly opened his eyes, looked at the road they came from and said, "They're here." Mo Chinga also opened her eyes and looked in the direction he was looking at. There was no one in sight, but she could feel the breath of other cultivators at the edge of her divine sense. Sure enough, before long, a group of black spots appeared in the distance and flew towards them. Mo Chinga raised her eyebrows and looked at Qin Shi with surprise. She underestimated him too much. He was in the peak stage of the core formation realm, so he was much stronger than her. Even if she practiced the soul refining art, she still couldn't catch up with him. She turned to look at the road and was stunned. These people seemed to be injured and their flying posture was a bit unstable. Not long after, when they flew closer, they saw that there were indeed bloodstains on their bodies. Fellow Taoist Shojing, fellow Taoist Qingwei. When they finally arrived, Taoist Kumu was relieved. Qin Shi frowned. "Fellow Taoists, what's going on?" The one who answered was Tong Tianyun. He seemed to be moving normally with only minor injuries. "So, we were about to break the restriction to get the treasure when another group of cultivators came and fought with them. That's not a big deal. We're stronger than these people, but when we were fighting and both sides were injured, two nascent soul cultivators came, so since there was a nascent soul cultivator interfering, the core formation cultivators naturally had to obediently back off." Mo Chinga couldn't help but glance at Qin Shi. Was it a coincidence or did he notice something? Aside from Tong Tianyun, Jing Xingji was the one with the least injuries. After all, he was a sword cultivator, and fights of magical powers were his forte. He said, "Those two nascent soul cultivators didn't have it easy either. There was a group of strange flying insects hidden in that ship. As soon as we left, we saw them trigger the restriction and attract the flying insects to attack. Even if they obtained the magic treasure, they would definitely be injured." Taof Shiamo and Mo Mozemo gus surprised. It turned out the spiritual aura she sensed was actually a group of flying insects. At this moment, Madame Feng was already sitting cross-legged with her eyes closed, meditating to heal her injuries. Without opening her eyes, she only sneered and said, "That flying insect is a type of extremely poisonous ancient flying insect. In my opinion, those two aren't just injured, they're seriously injured." Poisonous insects were the majority. Madame Feng specialized in poisons, so she naturally knew insects like the back of her hand. Hearing this, Taoist Kumu revealed a smile. "In that case, it's a blessing in disguise. Yes. With our strength, I'm afraid we can't escape unscathed from dealing with so many flying insects." Hearing her words, the group of people who were originally indignant felt relieved and sat down to heal their injuries. Mo Chinga had a bad feeling. When they entered Demonic Mountain one day, all of them were full of spiritual aura, but after one day 5 of them were injured. Tong Tianyun and Jing Xingji seemed to only have minor injuries, but the others' injuries couldn't be healed in a short time. Their strength had already been reduced. She glanced at Qin Shi and found that he was very calm. Just as she was wondering what he was thinking, she heard his private message, "Get ready. We have to separate from them in advance." Mo Chinga was stunned. She glanced at him and replied, "Senior Marshal Brother, even if some of them are injured, they can still help us, right?" Qin Shi said, "It's not because they're injured but because they're obviously anxious. With this mentality, something bad will happen sooner or later." Mo Chinga didn't say anything. She knew Qingxi was right. The 5 of them came to Demonic Mountain with a goal, but they couldn't control themselves in front of that magic weapon. Half a day passed. The first to finish healing was Taoist Kumu. He was a late-stage core formation cultivator after all. When Lei Dongqing and Madame Feng both stopped to adjust their breaths and said they were fine, the group continued to move forward. Their goal was the red leaf ant colony that looked no different from the forest. Protect yourself with spiritual aura, Qingxi said in a low voice when they stopped in front of the red leaves forest. Emo Chenga nodded. After forming her gold core, her art of primordial unity energy had reached the initial level, and the white silk handkerchief's defensive function was much stronger than before, so she was very confident in protecting herself. Madame Feng, Taoist Kumu asked, "Are your injuries serious?" Madame Feng's face was still a bit pale, but she insisted, "It's not a big deal. They're just red leaf ants. I can deal with them." Emo Chenga could see that Madame Feng's injuries definitely weren't serious. Her cultivation level and spells were only ordinary, and Emo Chenga hadn't seen her with any top-grade magic weapons. It was most likely because she had extraordinary special techniques that she was able to enter this formation. Now it was her turn to fight. If she couldn't do it, she would definitely lose her position. At that time, without the protection of her teammates, it would be difficult for her to survive on Demonic Mountain. Therefore she could only force herself to fight. How could the others not know? But they wouldn't say much. They were all sensible people, and it was good that Madame Feng was sensible. Taoist Kumu nodded and said to the others, "That being the case, let's go in." This was the first time the 7 of them fought an enemy together, so Emo Chenga was calm. She wanted to see what the others were capable of. They walked into the red leaf forest step by step. If Emo Chenga hadn't known that these trees were all red leaf ants in disguise, she probably wouldn't have been on guard at all. These red leaf ants were too good at disguising themselves. From the trunks to the branches to the leaves, they were all very lifelike. Only by carefully observing with divine sense could one find that there were many tiny spiritual aura fluctuations on these trees. As if sensing their spiritual aura, the red leaves suddenly floated down from their heads, disintegrated in midair, and turned into red flying ants, pouncing on them. The 6 people surrounded Madame Feng. Each of them protected their bodies with spiritual aura and released their magic weapons. Emo Chenga took out a jade bottle. This bottle was called the Royal Water Bottle. It had water properties and contained turbulent waves, which was the best way to deal with these red leaf ants with fire properties. Then she released Xiaohua. In a weak situation, spiritual beasts were the best companions. Seeing Xiaohua, Taoist Kumu glanced at it and looked a little surprised. 5th-rank spiritual beasts were rare, especially when their master was a cultivator in the early stage of the core formation realm. Spiritual beasts rarely had medicinal pills to eat, so it was often harder for them to advance in realms than cultivators. Generally, only cultivators like them who had been in the core formation realm for a long time could have spiritual beasts above the 5th rank. Soon the red leaf ants pounced on them. They had no time to think about other things and focused on fighting the enemies. Emo Chenga waved the white silk handkerchief, which turned into a mist and enveloped her body. Then she raised the royal water bottle into the air and poured down a column of water. Insects weren't classified as spiritual beasts. They didn't have any classification such as 1st or 2nd rank, and their individual spiritual aura was also very weak. Their strength was determined by the strength of their body and the strength of their toxicity. For example, these red leaf ants were good at camouflage, had hard shells, and were highly toxic. One wasn't a big deal, but there were so many of them. If there was an oversight, it would cause a lot of trouble. Therefore they, a group of core formation cultivators, didn't dare to relax in the face of these red leaf ants with weak spiritual aura but extremely toxic and hard shells. Qingxi's 3-yang real fire sword rose into the air and spread a red light. Wherever it went, the red leaf ants fell one after another and were all scorched black. Jing Xingji wasn't weak either. Although he used a sword like Qingxi, his technique was completely different. The body of the sword was silvery white like snow, and the piercingly cold sword aura spread out, forming a silvery white light curtain in front of him. Lei Dongqing was still using his wine jar. Emo Chenga didn't know what kind of magic weapon this wine jar was, but she had miraculously seen it release spells of any of the 5 elements. Logically speaking, only those who had spiritual roots of a certain element could use spells of a certain element. Lei Dongqing naturally couldn't have 5 spiritual roots, so this magic weapon must be very special. Taoist Kumu and Tong Tianyun used another method. Tong Tianyun used some unknown spell with his bare hands, but as soon as these red leaf ants got close, they would fall. Taoist Kumu just muttered something and released the red-crowned crane he was riding to fight the enemies. The red leaf ants were small and weak, but there were so many of them that the 6-core formation cultivators couldn't kill them all in a short time. Instead, they had to carefully use their spiritual aura to protect themselves, lest they got bitten by accident. As more and more red leaf ants rushed into the sky, the pressure became greater and greater. Madame Feng, who was surrounded by them, sat down cross-legged, cautiously took out a small stove, burned a piece of incense, gathered spiritual aura in her palms, and pressed her palms on the incense burner. A fragrance that was neither orchid nor musk slowly spread out. Emo Chinga frowned slightly. This fragrance was a bit strange. At first it smelled very good, but there was a strange smell that made people feel very uncomfortable. She immediately held her breath. Then she saw that the flying ants all over the sky seemed to be drunk. They slowed down, swayed left and right, and almost fell down with one slap. Seeing this, everyone became spirited and used all their magic weapons to quickly harvest these flying ants. With the help of Madame Feng's unique incense, the battle was finally over after 2 hours. Most of the red leaf forest had disappeared, and the remaining red leaf ants were scattered and no longer posed a threat. Madame Feng also put away the incense burner. The 7 of them fought and retreated, passing through the red leaf ant forest. Chapter 277. Some distance away from the red leaves forest, the 7 of them stopped to take a rest. Because they were prepared, although the red leaf ants were fierce, they didn't cause any actual harm to them. Madame Feng, who looked pale and seemed to have consumed too much spiritual aura, probably due to the special cultivation technique she used with the incense. Taoist Kumu asked, "Madame Feng, are your injuries serious?" Madame Feng swallowed a medicinal pill and shook her head. "My spiritual aura is just exhausted. I'll be fine after a short rest." "That's good." Taoist Kumu looked at the others. "Rest in groups. There's still a lot of danger ahead, so you have to keep your spiritual aura abundant." Half a day later, everyone finally finished resting and continued on their way. After passing this rocky slope, they entered a dark forest. In Demonic Mountain, the spiritual aura was chaotic. Except for the part they just entered, which was no different from Mount Yuheng, the rest was full of rocks with almost no flowers or trees. Only after this part of the road did they appear one after another. However, the color of these plants was a bit strange. Most of them were dark green, which made people feel bad just by looking at them. She walked beside Emo Chenga and said, "The spiritual aura and devil aura are intertwined here, so these plants aren't ordinary spiritual plants." Emo Chenga carefully observed them. Sure enough, these trees all had a very obscure dark aura, which was obviously devil aura. No wonder the color of these trees was like this. After walking for a while in the forest, Taoist Kumu stopped first and said, "There's withered grass here, which can be regarded as a treasure. If you want to collect it, you can go now. The devil aura here is quite strong, so we can only stay for 2 hours at most. Plus, we have to hurry, so we only have an hour to search. We'll meet here in an hour." Emo Chenga turned to look at Qin Shi. Qin Shi said, "In that case, Junior Marshal Sister and I will go first." Taoist Kumu nodded. "Fellow Taoists, don't forget the meeting time." Qin Shi raised his hand, glanced at Emo Chenga, and took the lead to leave the group. Emo Chenga also saluted everyone, then turned around and followed after them. After walking in silence for a while, Qin Shi suddenly stopped. "Be careful of Kumu and Tong Tianyun." Emo Chenga was stunned. "Senior Marshal Brother, what did you notice?" Qin Shi shook his head. "So far there's nothing suspicious. However, after thinking about it for a long time, I concluded that Old Man Tong must have prepared for this trip by exchanging for the 10,000-year-old spirit grass. But even if they obtained some unique treasures on Demonic Mountain, how many of them could be compared to 10,000-year-old spiritual plants?" Emo Chenga thought about it and couldn't help but nod. That was right. Even if they obtained a 10,000-year-old spiritual plant on Demonic Mountain, it would still be an extremely sensational matter. With a 10,000-year-old spiritual plant, they could exchange it with a nascent soul cultivator for some spiritual objects that could help them advance their realms. Why would they still need to enter Demonic Mountain? What he was after was definitely more precious than a 10,000-year-old spiritual herb. "Senior Marshal Brother, are you saying that they might be harboring evil intentions towards us?" "Not necessarily." Qin Shi said, "If they're plotting something big, then there's no need for them to make a move on us because of a small loss. However, the reason why we've gathered together is to advance and retreat together. If they abandon us when they're in danger, we'll still be in danger. Mo Chinga was silent for a while, then asked, since that's the case, wouldn't it be better if we split up with them earlier? That's the only way. Unfortunately, I can't contact Master. She thought for a while, then took something out of his robe and gave it to her. Eat this. This is. The thing he gave her was a jade bottle used to store medicinal pills. Inside it was a bright red medicinal pill with a strange smell. She'd never seen it before. This is an 8 Immortals pill. After you eat it, your meridians will become extremely chaotic for a short period of time. At that time, pretend that you're seriously injured and can't walk. Leave the rest to me. Mo Chinga understood what he wanted to do. She was actually dispensable to this group. If she was seriously injured, the others certainly wouldn't be willing to let her drag them down. Mo Chinga didn't think too much and silently swallowed the 8 Immortals pill. At the same time, in the middle of the forest, 2 people were also talking in low voices. How much time do we have? The one who asked was Tong Tianyun. Taoist Kumu did some calculations, then said, at the earliest, we still have 7 days. 7 days? Time is too tight. Tong Tianyun sighed. It wasn't easy for us to get this opportunity. If we can't make it in time, we'll suffer a big loss. Taoist Kumu looked calm. Don't worry. This time we've been prepared. The others aren't mediocre. We'll definitely reach Immortals' ruins within 7 days. Speaking of this, a trace of ruthlessness flashed across Tong Tianyun's thin face. Madame Feng is seriously injured. Will she drag us down? Taoist Kumu snorted and said coldly, you can rest assured about this. I've already thought about it. After we pass this forest, we'll encounter the chaotic forbidden zone. At that time, as long as we play a little trick, Madame Feng definitely won't be able to pass. That's for the best. Tong Tianyun thought for a moment, then asked, what about Mo Qingwei? Although her divine sense is indeed outstanding and her means aren't bad, her cultivation level is still a bit lacking. Forget about her, Taoist Kumu said slowly. Look at Qin Shoujing. He obviously values this junior martial sister very much. If we play any tricks, I'm afraid we won't be able to hide it from him. It'll be bad if he turns against us. Besides, Madame Feng is seriously injured, but Mo Qingwei has been preserving her strength. She's more or less a help. In times of crisis, we can just ignore her. As he said that, he glanced at Tong Tianyun. So it was you who advised me that this Master Taoist Qingwei's strength isn't bad. She probably won't drag us down. Tong Tianyun smiled, his dry face distorted horribly. He nodded in agreement. You're right. Although Mo Qingwei's cultivation level isn't high, she's extremely lucky. She hasn't been injured along the way, and judging from her moves, she's also not bad in fights of magical power. He then shook his head. Alas, this Qin Shoujing is really something. What kind of place is Demonic Mountain? He actually brought his junior martial sister who just formed her gold core. Not only do we have to worry about Qin Shoujing, but we also have to worry about their master, Lord Taoist Jinghe. Being tied up is really troublesome. Taoist Kumu snorted and said, why don't you think about it? If Mo Qingwei doesn't come, where can we get 10,000-year-old spiritual plants? Although crystal soul jade is good stuff, it's nothing in the eyes of those nascent soul cultivators. Without 10,000-year-old spiritual plants, we don't have the capital to bargain. That is true. Tong Tianyun was persuaded by Taoist Kumu, but after thinking about it, he still had some doubts. He asked, don't you think this Mo Qingwei looks a bit familiar? Taoist Kumu didn't take it seriously and said casually, does she look like an old lover of yours? Tong Tianyun snorted. I don't look like a human or a ghost. How could I have an old lover? Don't you really think she looks familiar? Especially when she fights of magical power. Hearing that, Taoist Kumu also remembered. It seems a bit familiar, but isn't she an elite disciple of Xianqing school? She's so young and has just formed her gold core, so she must have been cultivating on Mount Taikang. How could we have seen her? We might not have seen her in person? Tong Tianyun said while thinking, I seem to have seen someone who looks a bit similar to her. Similar? Taoist Kumu thought for a long time and shook his head. I don't have any impression. Her surname is Mo, but we don't seem to know any cultivators with the surname Mo. Tong Tianyun thought for a while but couldn't think of anything. Just as he was about to say something, his divine sense suddenly sensed someone approaching. He immediately said, someone's back. Before long, a person came out of the dense forest. When the two of them saw who it was, they were both shocked. He didn't even have the strength to greet the two of them. He put Mo Chinga down, fed her a medicinal pill and felt her meridians. His brows furrowed even more tightly. Fellow Taoist Shojing, what happened? Taoist Kumu asked first. Qin didn't even raise his head. We encountered demonic beasts. Although it was just a sentence, the other two looked at each other and saw the surprise in each other's eyes. Mo Chinga was obviously injured. Her chest was full of bloodstains, her face was pale and her breath was weak. It seemed her injuries weren't light. Tong Tianyun also reached out, pressed Mo Chinga's pulse, and explored her meridians. He frowned as soon as he did. Her meridians were too chaotic. He gave Taoist Kumu a look, and the two of them fell into contemplation. Madame Fong was seriously injured, but at least she could move freely. Mo Chinga was obviously half dead, much more seriously injured than Madame Fong. She looked a little anxious as if he didn't see anything. He supported Mo Chinga and asked softly, Junior Marshal Sister, how are you? Mo Chinga opened her eyes with difficulty but immediately closed them again. She just shook her head gently. Don't worry, Qin, she said. His voice was unprecedentedly soft. Rest for a while. When we get out of the forest, we'll find a place to heal your injuries. Hearing this, Taoist Kumu and Tong Tianyun looked at each other with a strange expression. Qin Shojing actually wanted to stall for time? Cough. Taoist Kumu cleared his throat and said, Fellow Taoist Shojing, how could your junior martial sister be so seriously injured? Qin didn't look up. It's useless to talk about this now. Fellow Taoists, let's get out of the forest quickly. You don't have to worry. My junior martial sister can take care of herself. The two of them didn't speak anymore. They communicated with each other with their eyes, both feeling a little unhappy. They both understood the meaning of Qin Shi's words. He was telling them that he would never give up on this junior martial sister. After a while, Lei Dongqing, Madame Fong, and Jing Xingji came back one after another. They were all startled to see Mo Chinga's appearance. How did you come back? Qin Shi looked up with an indifferent expression. Since you're all back, let's go. Fellow Taoist Shojing. Taoist Kumu finally spoke. Your junior martial sister is so seriously injured. Do you still want to take her with you? Qin Shi glanced at him and said gloomily, What do you mean, fellow Taoist Kumu? Do you want me to leave my junior martial sister here? Of course not. Taoist Kumu hastily denied. It's just, your junior martial sister's injuries won't heal in a short time. If fellow Taoist insists on continuing, I'm afraid her injuries will only worsen, won't they? Qin Shi's expression softened and he said, Then, what's fellow Taoist's idea? Seeing that he didn't seem to be angry, Taoist Kumu continued to say, I have an idea, but I don't know what fellow Taoist Shojing thinks. We've only been on Demonic Mountain for 2 days and most of the time was wasted on other things. If fellow Taoist takes your junior martial sister out of Demonic Mountain now, it'll only take 1 day at most. In that case, why don't you take her back and come back? Right after he finished speaking, Qin Shi sneered. Fellow Taoist, this is a good idea. In the end, you still think my junior martial sister is a burden to you, right? Fellow Taoist Kumu didn't say that. Tong Tianyun took over the conversation. His hoarse voice was a bit harsh. Fellow Taoist, think about it. Master Taoist Qingwei's injuries are so serious. What will happen if she continues? You don't have to worry about that. I'll protect her. Fellow Taoist Shojing. Seeing how stubborn he was, Taoist Kumu was also annoyed. We entered Demonic Mountain to look for treasures. If you take your junior martial sister with you like this, what should we do? Qin Shi didn't say anything. He just stared coldly at the people in front of him. Taoist Kumu and Tong Tianyun were very persistent. Madame Fong and Lei Dongqing looked away. Jing Xingji seemed to sigh regretfully and no longer looked at him. These people's attitudes were very obvious. There was no need to say anything. I understand. Qin Shi finally spoke. Taoist Kumu and Tong Tianyun heaved sighs of relief. Just when they thought he accepted their suggestion, they heard him say, You're still worried about being implicated. That being the case, we'd better go our separate ways. From now on, our lives and deaths have nothing to do with you. You. Everyone was stunned. Taoist Kumu blurted out, Fellow Taoist Shojing, don't be impulsive. Aren't you courting death by taking your junior martial sister with you? I survived more than 80 years ago, let alone today. Qin Shi's voice was flat, but it carried a hint of pride. Fellow Taoists, farewell. After saying that, he ignored them. He picked up Mo Chinga and walked out of the forest. Chapter 278. After Qin Shi and Mo Tiange left, the forest became quiet. Lei Dongqing touched his bald head and looked at Taoist Kumu. What's wrong with Qin Shoujing? He wasn't this kind before. Madame Feng sneered and said, I'm afraid he has some thoughts about this junior martial sister. I really didn't expect Qin Shoujing to have such a day. Woman Feng. Lei Dongqing squinted at her. Are you dissatisfied because you couldn't seduce him? Madame Feng still sneered. No matter how talented Qin Shoujing is and how handsome he is, what does it have to do with me? Aren't you jealous at all? Lei Dongqing asked recklessly. Madame Feng was annoyed. Old Lei, get lost. I'm not that bored. While the two of them were arguing, the other three people didn't say anything. After a while, Taoist Kumu finally understood and looked at Jing Xingji. Fellow Taoist Jing, what do you think? Jing Xingji, who had been thinking, shook his head. I can't guess Qin Shoujing's thoughts. Since he doesn't want to accept, we can only do this. Taoist Kumu and Tong Tianyun glanced at each other, feeling depressed. They were clear about Qin Shoujing's ability. Back then he was already the strongest among them, let alone now. The peak stage of the core formation realm was much stronger than the middle stage of the core formation realm. In fact, they were afraid of inviting Qin Shoujing this time. After more than 80 years, no one knew how strong he was now. Last time, when they saw him fighting with Jing Xingji in the middle of the night, they secretly asked Jing Xingji about it, but Jing Xingji didn't say anything. However, judging from his expression, he was obviously very afraid of Qin Shoujing. Now that Qin Shoujing left, the strength of their team was greatly affected, and they didn't know whether they could pass the next hurdle or not. Tong Tianyun knew what Taoist Kumu was thinking and whispered, it's good that he left. Otherwise we still have to be on guard against him. Taoist Kumu nodded inwardly. Indeed, Qin Shoujing was a great help, but if he fell out with them it would be troublesome. Clearing his throat, Taoist Kumu raised his voice. Everyone, since those two fellow Taoists have other ideas, we shouldn't force them. Only the 5 of us will go next. We all know that. Lei Dongqing pouted. There's no other way. Old Taoist, let's find a place to rest first. There aren't many people and they're all injured. Among them, Madame Feng was the only one who had suffered the most serious injury. Naturally he said this for her sake. Upon hearing what he said, Madame Feng's expression eased a little, and she also looked towards Taoist Kumu. Hesitation flashed in Taoist Kumu's eyes, but he quickly made a decision. Alright, let's get out of here as soon as possible and find a safe place to rest for the time being. In any case, their current strength was a bit lacking, but Madame Feng couldn't be left behind. Once they were out of the forest, Qin Shi summoned his flying cloud and flew close to the ground with Mo Tiange in his arms. Mo Tiange moved several hundred miles away before she finally raised her head and asked, Are you all right now? Qin Shi stopped the flying cloud and let go of her. With an expressionless face he said, It's all right now. You should adjust your breathing first. After a while your spiritual aura will flow smoothly. Mo Tiange looked around. The place they were currently in was a flat grassland. What was rare was that this place was full of pure spiritual aura and didn't have any devil aura at all. Because of that, the weeds grew very lush and green. It was a normal color. She randomly chose a place to sit down and meditated cross-legged. The 8 Immortals pill was actually a kind of medicinal pill that could help with cultivation. It was concocted from 8 kinds of rare spiritual plants. When one took it, the spiritual aura seemed chaotic, but in fact, it was because the medicinal power of this medicinal pill impacted the meridians. As long as one meditated and adjusted their breathing for a while, the medicinal power would flow smoothly. Just now, when Mo Tiange took the 8 Immortals pill, they casually got some blood from the Fengxing beast's corpse, so it looked like she was attacked by a demonic beast. If one looked carefully, it would be very easy to see that she wasn't really injured. However, men and women were different and Qin Shi was here, so Kumu and Taoist Kumu naturally wouldn't look carefully. Mo Tiange began to adjust her breathing. Qin Shi raised his hand and summoned the 3 Yang Real Fire Sword. With a wave of his hand, the sword turned into thousands of red sword lights that leisurely circled around the two of them, forming a sword formation around them. When Mo Tiange finished adjusting her breathing, she opened her eyes and saw this incomparably gorgeous sword lights. She secretly praised in her heart. No wonder there are so many sword cultivators. Not only are they strong in fights of magical powers, but their sword moves are always more gorgeous than other spells. Seeing that she finished adjusting her breathing, Qin Shi, who was also meditating on the side, also opened his eyes. Done? She had completely dissolved the medicinal power of the 8 Immortals pill, so her meridians were very smooth. Qin Shi stood up. Then let's go. Mo Chinga silently stood up and followed him. Qin Shi knew the route of Kumu and the others very well, so he deliberately avoided them and chose another direction. Since we're not going the same way as them, we might as well take a shortcut. Mo Chinga was a bit confused. Senior Marshal Brother, since we can take a shortcut, why did we go with them in the beginning? Qin Shi didn't speak for a while. After a while he said, there's a spiritual plant growing on that road which is the main material for concocting clear sky pills. After a pause he continued to say, more than 80 years ago, I entered Demonic Mountain together with them. Whether it's in terms of strength or character, they were both passable. Besides, your father was also friends with them back then, so presumably, you'd also be willing to meet his old friends. He was now in the peak stage of the core formation realm, so no matter how powerful clear sky pills were, they were useless to him. Presumably, the second reason was the real reason. Mo Chinga lowered her head and didn't say anything. She didn't know whether this was an illusion or not, but it really terrified her. Ever since she left Shenqing school with him, the things that happened and the times they spent together made her doubt what she originally believed. She vaguely felt that this was the senior martial brother Qin from back then. There were some things he didn't need to do at all, but if he did, there would be no other reason than to think of her. Could it be that her previous perception was wrong? It wasn't that Qin Shi was Qin Shoujing, but that Qin Shoujing was Qin Shi? It's useless to talk about this now. He sighed softly, looking very worried. This time, not to mention others, Kumu and Old Tong are obviously disloyal. That being the case, it's better if we don't go the same way as them. It'd be best if we don't run into them again. Mo Chinga answered with her head lowered, absent-mindedly. Qin Shi noticed this and turned to stare at her. What are you thinking about? Huh? Mo Chinga felt as if she was caught doing something bad on the spot, so she was a bit flustered. No, nothing. After staring at her for a long time, Qin Shi turned back. Focus. There's only the two of us, so we can't be distracted. Got it? Before they set off, she was resentful that Qin Shi ignored her existence. Now that they were on Demonic Mountain, she had to be more careful if she didn't want to be looked down upon by him. Mo Chinga took a deep breath, threw her messy thoughts to the back of her mind and followed him briskly. After walking for a while, Qin Shi suddenly stopped and listened attentively, seemingly using his divine sense to detect something. After a while he said, how's your breath-concealing technique? Breath-concealing technique? Mo Chinga didn't understand what he wanted to do. However, although her breath-concealing technique was ordinary, it wouldn't be a problem for her to pretend to be a mortal with the spirit-concealing pendant on her. She immediately stopped using the art of chaotic origin, concealed her aura and asked, is this okay? Qin Shi was slightly surprised. What kind of breath-concealing technique is this? It's actually so miraculous? Mo Chinga shook her head. My breath-concealing technique is really ordinary. I have to thank Senior Marshal Brother's spirit-concealing pendant for this. When I met Great Ancestor back then, Great Ancestor refined this pendant again. With this thing I can completely conceal my aura. I see. With this explanation, Qin Shi felt relieved. Since a deification senior refined this pendant, it was naturally much stronger than when he refined it. Mo Chinga hesitated for a moment, then asked, Senior Marshal Brother, if we completely conceal our aura, we won't even be able to release our protective spiritual aura. What if we encounter a wandering restriction? Qin Shi didn't answer immediately. Instead, he waved his arm, taking back the light curtain formed by the three young real fire sword that had been protecting them. He then used an art. After a while, he also didn't carry any spiritual aura on his body, just like her. After that, he took out 2 talismans and handed one to her. This is a spirit-transforming talisman. It can form a barrier around your body. Outsiders can't feel it, but it can block those restrictions. Mo Chinga took it, nodded, and stuck it on her body as he said. After that, Qin Shi said, there are people fighting ahead. Their cultivation levels are only in the foundation building realm, but we don't need to cause trouble. We can just go around them. Mo Chinga didn't object. They had their own destination, so it wasn't worthwhile to get involved in a dispute for these spiritual treasures. They were only foundation building cultivators now. Maybe some core formation cultivators would pass by later. If they got involved, they wouldn't be able to get rid of them. After doing all that, the two of them turned into flight lights and continued to move forward silently. After a while, Mo Chinga also sensed something with her divine sense. There were spiritual aura fluctuations in the distance. 2 groups of people were fighting. This was a common occurrence on Demonic Mountain. Although there were many secret treasures on the mountain, there were dangers everywhere. Cultivators below the nascent soul realm didn't dare to go too deep and could only try their luck in the periphery. If they happened to see a spiritual treasure just like the boat-shaped magic weapon they saw, it would cause a lot of people to fight over it. Therefore, on Demonic Mountain not only did they have to guard against the restrictions left behind, but they also had to guard against demonic beasts, poisonous creatures and sneak attacks from other cultivators. In this way, most of the cultivators who died on Demonic Mountain were killed by their own kind. Emo Chenga was about to quietly go around when she suddenly stopped. There were two groups of people fighting. One group had 6 people and the other group had 5 people. In the group of 6 there were 4 men and 2 women. Most of them were in the early stage of the foundation building realm. 1 man and 1 woman were in the middle stage of the foundation building realm. Although they had 1 more person than their opponents, they were in a suppressed situation. Among the 5 opponents, 4 were in the middle stage of the foundation building realm, and only 1 was in the early stage. Right now both sides were fighting fiercely. Magic tools were all used and spells filled the sky. Near them, Emo Chenga saw a stalk of spiritual plant that looked several thousand years old. Although they were fighting fiercely, they cautiously avoided that stalk of spiritual plant. Apparently they were fighting because of this spiritual plant. Seeing that she stopped moving, she turned his head and asked, "What's wrong?" Emo Chenga stared at the people in the field and said, "Look at them." Chapter 279. She turned around and looked at them. His brows slowly wrinkled. "There, people from Yunwu sect," Emo Chenga finished his sentence. She sighed softly as she looked at their black robes. This was a set of clothes they were familiar with. Fortunately, the sect's emblem was still a few clouds. It seemed the matter Louis Dao talked about last time had succeeded. Yunwu sect had retaken its monastery and from now on, it no longer needed to be bullied by Wuxia sect. What made Emo Chenga stop wasn't only because she saw Yunwu sect's disciples, but because the 2 women among them looked very familiar. "It's them?" She also recognized them. And, after watching for a while, Emo Chenga turned around and said, "Senior Marshal Brother Shoujing, if you want to go then go. They're just a few foundation building cultivators," she said flatly. Emo Chenga hesitated for a moment then nodded. "Thank you." The 6 people from Yunwu sect were obviously at a disadvantage, especially since their opponents were all male cultivators. While they were fighting they also made dirty jokes about the 2 women among them. When the 2 women heard their opponents teasing, one looked ashamed and resentful, while the other looked extremely cold. Emo Chenga couldn't help but recall that nearly 70 years ago, when they were in Miwu Valley, they were also teased by Wuxia sect's disciples. Both of them were angry at that time, but now one looked disappointed and ashamed while the other ignored everything. She sighed softly and released her spiritual aura pressure. The spiritual aura pressure of a core formation cultivator shrouded them. The 11 people present were all shocked and stopped fighting one after another. When they turned around, they saw Emo Chenga standing not far from them and she standing behind her. The first thing the 5 non-Yunwu sect disciples noticed was the clothes they were wearing. Shocked, they hastily bowed and saluted them. Turns out it's core formation seniors from Shenqing School. "Juniors greet you." Upon hearing what he said, the people from Yunwu sect were also shocked. They also bowed to greet him. "Juniors greet seniors." Emo Chenga nodded and looked at the 5 cultivators first. "Which cultivation group are you from?" Shame appeared on the 5 people's faces. The leader answered respectfully, "Senior, we were originally disciples of Jingxin sect." Jingxin sect? He had never heard of this sect. The leader was very quick-witted. When he saw the confusion on her face, he immediately said, "The Pure Heart sect is just a small sect. Now, it was destroyed decades ago. After we destroyed our own sect, we became rogue cultivators." "I see." This kind of sect extermination wasn't rare. There were many small and medium-sized cultivation groups in the Celestial Pole. If their talents withered or if they provoked a powerful enemy, it was very likely that their sect would be exterminated overnight. Those who escaped had nowhere to go for a while, so they became individual cultivators. Seeing that her attitude was amiable, the man became bolder and said, "Does Senior fancy this crimson-red grass? If Senior takes a fancy to it, Junior will naturally offer it up with both hands." The corners of Emo Chenga's mouth couldn't help but curve upwards. This man was very good at talking. Although the 5 of them were stronger than the 6 people from Yunwu sect, It didn't mean that Yunwu sect had no chance of winning. If she took a fancy to this crimson grass, they naturally wouldn't have any hope. The implication of this person's words was that he directly took the credit for offering the grass and ignored the people from Yunwu sect. In any case, they also wouldn't dare to raise any objections. The 6 people from Yunwu sect naturally understood the meaning of his words and glared at each other. The man immediately raised his eyebrows and said, "Don't tell me you want to compete with a core formation senior for this spiritual plant?" Upon hearing what he said, the people from Yunwu sect became even more angry and anxious. On one hand, they felt this person was really hateful. With just a few words, he wanted to frame them for wanting to compete with a core formation cultivator over a spiritual plant. On the other hand, they were afraid Mo Tienga would really misunderstand. Among the 6 people, only the middle stage foundation building female cultivator looked calm. At that moment, she respectfully bowed and raised her hand. Since seniors want this spiritual plant, junior naturally doesn't have any reason to compete. "Senior, please don't listen to this person's provocation." Mo Tienga stared at this female cultivator. Her expression was calm and her manner was magnanimous. She really had the courage to stand on her own. She couldn't help but sigh again. "Senior Martial Sister Wang, long time no see." Once she said that, the female cultivator was dumbfounded. The other people present, including the 5 non-Yunwu sect cultivators, were also dumbfounded. "Senior Martial Sister Wang," they all heard Yunwu sect cultivators call this female cultivator, and they indeed called her Senior Martial Sister Wang. Who was this core formation senior in the end? She actually called this female cultivator that? The 2 Yunwu sect female cultivators stared at Mo Tienga attentively. All of a sudden, one of them cried out in surprise, Your junior martial brother Yi?" Mo Tienga smiled and nodded at that person. "Senior Martial Sister Shen." These 2 people were Wang Chenyi and Shen Bing from back then. Shen Bing's cultivation level was in the early stage of the foundation building realm, but her beauty hadn't decreased from before. As for Wang Chenyi, she was already in the middle stage of the foundation building realm. Compared to Shen Bing in the past, she wasn't very eye-catching. Now, however, she was as cold as ice and as beautiful as a peach. Mo Tienga couldn't help but recall the bitter experiences they had all these years. Back then, Shen Bing was forced to become a concubine while Wang Chenyi married her enemy. More than 10 years later, Louis Dao mentioned to her that Shen Bing was already free while Wang Chenyi was still married to that person. Mo Tienga didn't know whether they had escaped from the sea of bitterness or not. Judging from their current appearances, they seemed to be living pretty well. Upon hearing Shen Bing's reminder, Wang Chenyi also remembered. Astonishment appeared on her calm and composed face. "You're really junior martial brother Yi?" Mo Tienga nodded with a bitter smile. They hadn't seen each other for more than 60 years. She never expected their next meeting would be like this. Upon seeing this scene, the expressions of the 5 people in the small group changed greatly. They never expected this core formation senior would actually be acquainted with the other party. Right now, their faces were filled with apprehension and trepidation. They didn't know whether this senior would kill them out of anger or not. After hesitating for a long time, the leader finally said, "Turns out these fellow Taoists are senior's old acquaintances. Juniors really had eyes but failed to see. I hope senior won't take offense." In the end, he was already begging. Mo Tienga cast them an indifferent glance, then said, "That'll do. I won't make things difficult for you. You can leave now." Upon hearing what she said, the 5 people were overjoyed. They repeatedly cupped their hands and said, "Thank you, senior. Thank you, senior." They didn't dare to stay any longer. Using their flying magic tools, they quickly fled into the distance. Mo Tienga no longer paid attention to them. She smiled at Wang Chenyi and Shen Bing. "Not bad. Senior martial sisters have a good memory." Upon receiving her affirmation, Wang Chenyi and Shen Bing glanced at each other, feeling very strange. She was wearing Xianqing School's robe, emitting the spiritual aura pressure of a core formation cultivator, and her movements were confident and calm. She was completely different from the cautious and smiling junior martial brother Yi from back then. What made them feel even more strange was that although junior martial brother Yi was a handsome youth, he didn't look like a woman at all. On the other hand, Mo Tienga in front of them was elegant and elegant. She obviously looked like a woman. After a long time, Wang Chenyi sighed with a gloomy expression. "Turns out we were blind back then. Junior martial brother Yi, have you been well these years? Where did you go?" Mo Tienga also sighed when she mentioned the past. When she met Louis Dao at Xianqing School, although they talked about what happened after they parted, she asked him not to reveal her whereabouts. Although Louis Dao wasn't too kind about Su Jingji's matter, it seemed he still covered it up for her. About what happened back then. Senior Marshal sisters, when you go back you can ask Senior Marshal Brother Lu. Senior Marshal Brother Lu knows? Wang Qinyi was surprised. Mo Qingge nodded and didn't say much about this issue. Instead she asked, Senior Marshal sisters, why did you come to Demonic Mountain? Wang Qinyi sighed and said, Junior Marshal Brother Yi, you might not know this, but although we recaptured Yunwu sect, we suffered disastrous losses. We only have a few core formation cultivators left. If we followed the usual routine, I'm afraid we wouldn't be able to advance to the core formation realm, so we came to take a gamble. I see. Mo Qingge thought for a moment then said, this place is already very dangerous for foundation building cultivators. Take this spiritual plant and go back. In the end, fated chances aren't as important as your lives. Xinbing was pleasantly surprised. Junior Marshal Brother Yi, are you saying you'll let us have this spiritual plant? Mo Qingge nodded. She naturally didn't care about a mere 1,000-year-old spiritual plant. She thought again and took out several jade bottles and talismans from her robe. Now isn't the time to reminisce. If we're fated, we'll go out and talk about our feelings after we parted. Take these medicinal pills and go out. This dangerous place isn't something you can handle. Wang Qinyi silently took the things Mo Qingge handed her and solemnly saluted her. Thank you. Mo Qingge smiled. Without saying anything, she turned around and walked towards Qin Shi. Junior Marshal Brother Yi. Wang Qinyi called out from behind her. You? How are we going to find you in the future? Mo Qingge waved her hand. Go ask Senior Marshal Brother Lu yourself. We'll meet again someday. Once she finished speaking, she once again concealed her aura and left with Qin Shi. Watching their backs, Xinbing's brows furrowed even tighter. She suddenly asked, Junior Marshal Sister Wang, look, isn't that Senior Marshal Brother Qin? Senior Marshal Brother Qin? Wang Qinyi didn't understand what Mo Qingge meant at first, but when she recalled that person's appearance, she was also shocked. Is that Senior Marshal Brother Qin? It's most likely him. Xinbing watched their backs as they left together. Her expression was complicated. So Junior Marshal Brother Yi is actually a woman, and he also became a disciple of Shenqing School together with Senior Marshal Brother Qin. I really don't know what they experienced. The two of them looked at each other in silence, pondering in their hearts. Mo Qingge's appearance reminded them of many old things. Some of these old things were very happy, but some were very sad. The other 4 cultivators were dumbfounded as they watched what happened. Finally, one of them couldn't help but ask, Senior Marshal sisters, why did you call that Senior? Junior Marshal Brother Yi? Wang Qinyi smiled bitterly and said, more than 60 years ago she was a disciple of our Yunwu sect. Presumably she was a woman disguised as a man. What? The 4 people were shocked. More than 60 years ago. Senior Marshal sister still hadn't built her foundation, right? Correct. Wang Qinyi stared in the direction they left. At that time, Junior Marshal Brother Ye's cultivation level was even lower than ours. She was just an aura-refining disciple. We originally thought something bad had happened to her, but unexpectedly, the affairs of the world were unpredictable. Mo Qingge couldn't help but think of these words. Back then, Junior Marshal Brother Yi, Senior Marshal Brother Qin, and Senior Marshal Brother Jiang disappeared together. The branch master also said that Junior Marshal Brother Yi was a traitor. Both Wang Qinyi and Xinbing didn't believe it, but since they couldn't find Mo Qingge, they couldn't do anything about it. Later they gradually forgot about this matter. She really didn't expect that after more than 60 years, they would actually see Junior Marshal Brother Yi again. Only then did they discover that she was actually a woman and had even formed her gold core. Xinbing said in a daze that Senior Marshal Brother Qin seems to have also formed his gold core. They are actually so talented? Chapter 280. After seeing Wang Qinyi and Xinbing, Mo Qingge's mood was somewhat heavy. For the first time she witnessed the tragic fate of female cultivators. One lost her father and had to marry her enemy. The other lost her freedom and became a puppet. They were cultivators, but they were also women. Without enough power they couldn't even protect their bodies. This world was just so cruel. Fortunately they seemed to be doing well now. Although they didn't have enough pills and were still struggling on the path of cultivation, at least they had freedom. After thinking for a while, Qin Shi suddenly asked, do you sympathize with them? Mo Qingge was stunned for a moment before she answered, of course. They were very miserable. how is it terrible? For a woman, if she can't even protect herself, of course it's miserable. She didn't say anything. No one knew what he was thinking. The two of them concealed their auras and avoided the other cultivators. Their journey was daunting but not dangerous, and they arrived at the foot of a mountain. Chenga looked up. It's so high. Even if we fly, it'll be very difficult to fly up, right? Demonic Mountain was the highest mountain in the celestial pole, worthy of its name. This mountain peak pierced straight into the clouds, and its peak couldn't be seen at all. She said, there's a place we can land on, so flying up won't be a problem. It's just that. He stared at the lightning formed by the intertwining spiritual aura and devil aura in midair. There are a lot of restrictions on this place. If we're not careful, we might turn into ashes. Chenga was shocked. Ashes scattered and vanished in a puff of smoke. In other words, they couldn't even be saved. Don't overthink it. She said calmly, it might take us 2 days to reach the summit. There are still many restrictions up there that need to be broken, so it's very troublesome. Let's go up there as soon as possible. The two of them used their own methods to protect themselves. Chenga used the art of primordial singular energy and took out the white silk handkerchief, transforming it into a mist-like barrier. Shi, on the other hand, also used his body-protecting art. He also made the three-yang real fire sword transform into a body-protecting sword formation that surrounded the two of them. Chenga hesitated for a moment before saying, Senior Martial Brother Qin, you come a bit closer to me. I don't have enough spiritual aura, so I can't reach this protective magic weapon. Shi was stunned. He didn't know whether it was because of the way she addressed him or because of what she said. In the end, he only responded softly. This peak was called 10,000 feet peak. Although it might not be 10,000 feet high, it was not far from it. The spiritual qi and devil qi in this area were turbulent and intertwined with each other. The two of them did not dare to fly too fast and could only advance bit by bit. To maintain the same distance, Chenga didn't use her own flying magic weapon. Instead, she boarded Shi's flying cloud. Half a day later, the two of them rested on the mountain wall for a while before continuing forward. At this moment, they were already close to the place where spiritual aura and devil aura intertwined in the sky. They were surrounded by protective spiritual aura, followed by defensive talismans, then a layer of spiritual aura formed by Chenga's white silk handkerchief, and finally, Shi's sword formation. Even with 4 layers of defense, he did not dare to let his guard down. When she passed through the spiritual aura and devil aura, Chenga heard the sword formation outside making buzzing sounds. Fortunately, the three-yang real fire sword wasn't an ordinary magic weapon. Whether it was spiritual aura or devil aura, it was able to block it. However, every time he blocked it, the sword formation would emit a red light, and Shi would have to stop for a while to resist it. The two of them went up bit by bit, but the higher they went, the more difficult it became. In the end, it was no longer Shi's problem alone. Although his sword formation could block most of the attacks, it couldn't completely resolve them, so Chenga used the white silk handkerchief to help. Shi had already said that they couldn't be the slightest bit careless in this place. As long as the spiritual aura and devil aura broke through their defense layer, there would be no way to save them and they would instantly turn into ashes. Here. When their spiritual aura was about to be exhausted again, Shi pointed at a tiny crack in the mountain wall. Inside it was an extremely small cave. In order to resist the restrictions, gales and lightning formed by the intertwining spiritual aura and devil aura, they had to maintain enough spiritual aura. Now that their spiritual aura was almost exhausted, they had to find a place to adjust their breathing and recover. The two of them squeezed into this small cave with difficulty and heaved sighs of relief. The crack in this cave was very small, so they could only pass through it sideways. With the mountain wall blocking them, there were no gales or big restrictions. There was only weak spiritual aura and devil aura. But it was really too small. It was only big enough for the two of them to sit side by side. They were so close together that they almost couldn't move. Chenga felt very uncomfortable. She wasn't used to being so close to other people. Just as she was about to lean to the side, she heard Shi say, "Don't move. Quickly meditate and recover your spiritual aura." Chenga knew what he said was right, so she could only endure it. She sat cross-legged, slowly adjusted her breathing and entered a meditative state. After a while, her spiritual aura finally recovered and she opened her eyes. A large mass of devil aura floated over from outside and blocked the entrance of the crack. Shi had already finished adjusting his breathing and was waiting for her. He was startled and said, "Wait a moment. There's too much devil aura." The devil aura on Demonic Mountain was very violent. Once it sensed cultivators' breaths, it would rush forward and swallow them. Most of this devil aura was left behind from the distant past era. How could cultivators resist it? A small mass of devil aura could be eliminated, but such a large mass of devil aura couldn't be avoided. This mass of devil aura blocked the light that leaked through the crack and also blocked the sounds outside. Darkness and silence embraced each other. Cultivators' eyesight was better than mortals. Even if there was no light, they could roughly distinguish the things in front of them. But there was no light and everything in front of her was hazy. This kind of haze made Emo Chenga restless. She heard light breathing. After listening for a while, she seemed to hear a heartbeat again. At first it was calm, but it gradually became rapid. She pressed her chest and found it was hers. Strange. She tilted her head and thought to herself, "I just finished meditating, so my heart shouldn't be beating so fast." This kind of depression also seemed to affect Qinshi. He moved and his arm rubbed against her sleeve. The faintly discernible contact made Emo Chenga even more afraid to move. It seemed too close. Even their breaths were intertwined. This kind of awkward silence didn't last long. Suddenly she heard Qinshi say, "That year, your father and I also flew up from here." Emo Chenga was stunned and turned her head. In the darkness, Qinshi's eyes shone brightly. He said softly, "At that time a big restriction collapsed. More than half of the people who stayed on Demonic Mountain died or were injured. Your father and I happened to be here, so we avoided the disaster." "This place," Emo Chenga murmured. She reached out and touched the mountain wall next to her. "Father, has he also sat here and touched these stones? We hid for 7 days before the restriction finally stabilized, but, when we went out the way we came, we found we couldn't get out." Emo Chenga suddenly remembered that the restriction on Demonic Mountain only existed for about a month. If the restriction reappeared, they wouldn't be able to get out. And if they stayed here, they didn't know when the restriction would disappear again. The situation inside was unpredictable, and ordinary people couldn't wait until Demonic Mountain opened again. "Then, how did you get out?" "The secret is up there," Qinshi said. "There's a place they call Immortals' Ruins. According to legend, it's the place where immortals fell and were buried in the distant past era. The road to Immortals' Ruins is full of difficulties and dangers. Countless people died on that road in the past. However, they didn't know that there was actually a shortcut. If you go up this tens of thousands of feet peak, you'll reach the back of Immortals' Ruins." Emo Chenga was stunned. "There's a road in Immortals' Ruins that leads to the outside world?" Qinshi shook his head. "That's not accurate. The terrain there is very complicated. No one knows which place Immortals' Ruins is referring to. After we were trapped on Demonic Mountain, we searched many places and finally found a place with a restriction that could be broken." Hearing this, Emo Chenga thought for a while and became even more confused. "If we can get out, can't we also go in? Doesn't that mean we don't have to wait for the restriction outside to disappear?" Qinshi smiled and said, "Your thinking is too simple. At that time we encountered a lot of dangers. When we found that place we were all injured. Your father's injury was especially serious. He almost couldn't survive. When we gradually finished taking medicinal pills, his injury still didn't improve." After a pause he continued, "My injury was relatively light, so it wasn't a big problem. But even if we found that the restriction in that place was relatively weak and could be broken, we didn't have enough cultivation. According to my calculations, we needed to have at least the cultivation level of the nascent soul realm. Moreover, the restriction on Demonic Mountain is very special. If it wasn't because our inner force was weak, even if it was broken, the restriction would repair itself. I also thought so, but after I went out, I found that the restriction inside looked weak, but the one outside was much stronger than the one outside." "Then, what happened next?" "The cultivation technique I practice is called the art of 3 primordial cycles. The 3 primordial auras are the 3 primordial auras of extreme yang, extreme yin, and neutral. The word, cycle, means a kind of secret technique," Qinshi said slowly. "If I can absorb enough spiritual aura, I can temporarily break through my realm and reach the nascent soul realm. But this kind of nascent soul realm is only an illusion. It can only last for a very short period of time. The consequences are even more serious. It will make me fall back to the aura refining realm in an instant." "So that's how it is." Emo Chenga suddenly saw the light. No wonder father could help him leave Demonic Mountain. No wonder he lost a lot of his cultivation and became an aura refining disciple. When he was in Yunwu sect, his cultivation probably really fell back to the aura refining realm, right? Qin, she continued, when your father found out about this, he thought about it for 2 days and told me that his injury wouldn't heal anyway. That being the case, he was willing to use his cultivation to help me get out of trouble, but I had to promise to take care of his descendants on his behalf. I promised and even swore on my heart demon. In the darkness, his gaze swept over her and he said softly, at that time I didn't care at all. It was only a trivial matter. But I didn't expect it would be you. That was all he said, but it was enough to make people's imaginations roam. It would be her. What did he mean by that? The darkness and silence almost made her blurt out the question. But in the next moment, the devil aura gradually dispersed and light shone in again. He turned his head and his voice became cold again. Alright, let's continue. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.